Hey, I'm Mr. Ghost. If you love true horror stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. The stories you'll hear are shared by our audience from Reddit, and to keep their original essence, I read them exactly as they were written. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Also, check the timestamps in the comments for story titles and easy navigation. Now, let's dive into the darkness. Bubble bath. As part of my evening routine, I get my 5-year-old daughter Sophie ready for her bath. I bought some soap from a farmer's market on the other side of town, claiming to make extra bubbles, and it's pink, so I know she'll love it. I fill the tub with warm water and pour it in. Wow, this stuff is really pink, and the bubbles nearly spill out of the tub. I'm happy with my purchase, feeling like a proud mom. I gently plop Sophie in the colorful water as she hums softly, looking up and smiling at me. "What song are you singing, sweetie?" "I made it up," she says with a grin. She used to hate taking a bath, but she's really come around on them this year. She splashes around having fun, and I realize I should get her toys for her. I turn away for a second to open the cabinet, grabbing some foam alphabet letters she likes. I'm glad she likes them since they're educational as well. Gently, I fish out a rubber ducky from the cabinet for good measure too. Turning back to face my daughter, I notice the splashing has stopped. She's no longer in the tub. A wave of dread washes over me. How could this happen? I just saw her in my periphery 2 seconds ago. She couldn't have left my sight. I would have heard her. I'm in panic mode now, living out every mom's worst nightmare. I call out to her when she suddenly submerges from seemingly thin air. What the hell? Something is not right. She's somehow back in the tub, only she's almost unrecognizable. I gasp. I can see right through her, and she has a pink hue to her. How is this possible? I flail my arms, reaching out to grab her. Sophie's skin is slippery to the touch like slime. I recoil in horror. "Baby?" She stares back at me with a frightened look on her face before slipping back into depths of the tub. "No, come back. Sophie, baby." I violently dunk my hands into the tub, reaching for her yet only grabbing bubbles. Now sobbing, I throw my hands on my head. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Why is this happening? "Mommy?" she says, muffled by the water. I let out a loud gasp. "Baby? Are you okay?" "Mommy's here." I stare in sheer horror as my daughter returns to the surface. Somehow, her entire body is now made of bubbles, except for her eyes and internal organs, which now float amongst these bubbles. "Mommy, what's happening?" she says, crying though I can't see the tears. The more she cries, the more the bubbles pop. I try my absolute hardest to console her, desperately trying to get the bubbles to stop popping. "Baby, it's okay, I'm here," I say, crying so hard snot runs down my face. I scream. The bubbles won't stop popping. They won't stop. "You want to know why I'm doing this?" he whispered, about to swallow another needle. Daryl grinned, opened his mouth, and planted a second 3-inch needle onto his tongue, rolling it around the surface like a cherry stem he was preparing to tie into a knot. Left to right, right to left, right to left, left to right. I followed the needle, helplessly transfixed by the rhythm of the movement. After a few seconds, he let the needle rest, now sticky and shimmering with saliva. I met his gaze, shaking my head. "No." Wordlessly, I pleaded with him, begged him to move out of the doorway and let me leave. "Please, Daryl, I don't understand." He tilted his head back slowly, letting the golden barb slide to the edge of his throat. All the while, he stared into my eyes, savoring the panic. For a moment, he seemed to come to his senses, pivoted his jaw forward, placing his hand palm up in front of his mouth, like he was going to spit the damn thing out. At the same time, the wildness in his features waned. The grin melted down his face like candle wax, and his lips stopped quavering. I saw the tiniest hint of fear behind his eyes too. It's okay, just give me my phone back. I can call an ambulance." Before I could finish my sentence, he winked, licking his lips playfully, cradling the needle in his creased tongue as he did. In an instant, Daryl's mania returned at a fever pitch. Now I'll ask you again, Lenny. Do you see his sentence was interrupted by a bout of coughing so vicious that it caused him to double over, creating slightly more space between his body and the door that he had been blocking? When I realized he had only been toying with me, pretending to hear reason, my heart sank. He flung his thick jowls towards the ceiling like he was throwing back a shot of whiskey, and the needle disappeared down his throat. His mouth sputtered, coughing and choking violently, as the needle tore into his esophagus, blood rising up and pooling in his cheeks. The emotion driving his expression seemed to flicker, quickly swapping from hysteria to fear, and then back again in the blink of an eye. I couldn't help but imagine the sharp tip of the needle dragging down the inside of his throat like a rock climber digging their axe into the downward slope of a mountain, trying to slow the speed of their descent. I wailed and fell backwards onto the floor. The pain was unlike anything I'd experienced up to that point in my life. A vortex of fire and electricity churning in my forearm, trying to stabilize the pulverized joint. I wrapped my other hand around my broken wrist, staring at it in disbelief. I bolted, reaching for the knob. Right as I was about to grasp it, he snapped his hip back, sandwiching my wrist between his waist and the metal frame. A series of audible crunches filled the air, and agony detonated in my wrist like a pipe bomb. You want to know why I'm doing this, Lenny? Daryl stepped forward from the doorway. Looming over me, he bent down and gently put a meaty finger to my lips, shushing my howls. Reluctantly, my gaze lifted from my wrist to his eyes. When I finally quieted completely, he started anew. In his hand, he held out a black tin about the size of a matchbox, making a spectacle of showing me the details of the case like he was about to perform a magic trick. Golden stars and spirals covered the lid, forming a hypnotic pattern that straddled the line between purposeful and anarchic. He flicked the tin open with his thumb, revealing rows and rows of golden needles. They were thin, but that only made their ends appear sharper. 3 more needles onto his tongue, swallowed, fingers back into the tin. Please, Daryl, I don't understand. Just stop. We can figure this out, please. I whimpered. His pace accelerated. On his last handful, Daryl didn't even bother to lay them all in the same direction. Some were parallel to his tongue, others were horizontal, a bramble of tiny golden harpoons that fought back every step of the way as he attempted to force them down his throat. He gulped, coughed, and wheezed, never looking away from me. 5 more needles onto his tongue, swallowed, blood and saliva oozing over his trembling lips. Before he buckled over, blood spilling into the empty spaces in his abdomen from his stomach turned pincushion, Daryl whispered the 4 words that have haunted me for the last half-year. Why? Why are you doing this? So, I finally gave in to his game. I asked him. Words that played on an endless loop in my mind, at the police station, in the courtroom, everywhere. He wheezed and laughed. Because you made me. Daryl and I were born on the same day, thousands of miles apart from each other, cousins with very little in common. Because it wasn't just that we were born on the same day. We were born on the same day, in the same hour, with the same minute listed on both of birth certificates. It may have been the same second too, but the coincidence of our births connected us. Of course, that's impossible to prove. Despite that bizarre synchronicity, our deliveries were quite different. I was born full term, as planned, without a single complication. 38 weeks and a day of gestation, exactly as the doctor predicted. From what I'm told, my labor only lasted 15 minutes. I was alive and breathing before the morphine could even be brought to the room to help my mother weather the contractions. Painless, punctual, and healthy. Daryl was not blessed with my good fortune. My cousin was born 3 months early, practically out of the blue, and substantially underdeveloped. The doctors were baffled. My aunt had no risk factors for an extremely premature birth. Normally, there's some identifiable reason for it, whether it be placental abnormalities, drug abuse, or infection. But in his case, they couldn't find a single thing. He just appeared. Exact same time as I did, down to the minute, materialized from the pits of creation a whole season early, so that we could cross that threshold together. As you might imagine, babies born at 26 weeks of gestation don't enter this world healthy. I was born 6 pounds, 2 ounces. Daryl wasn't even born with a pound to his name. Spent the first 5 months of his life in the neonatal intensive care unit, tethered to the location by the IVs and the feeding tubes, like a dog leashed to a bike rack outside a bodega. waiting patiently for their owner to come back out with a pack of cigarettes so their life could continue. He was physically underdeveloped for the demands of reality. Lungs don't fully develop until at least 36 weeks, so he only existed for about a minute before a breathing tube needed to be placed down his throat. His blood vessels were exceptionally fragile too. It was like blood was being transported through overcooked penne rather than strong, fibrous tubing. Because of that, he bled into his brain 12 hours after they put the breathing tube in. No biologic issues, at least. Despite those hurdles, he lived. No long-term issues other than blindness in his left eye. The synchrony of our births became a family legend overnight. A story told over Thanksgiving dinners, in grocery store parking lots, during the coffee break after Sunday service. Over and over and over again until the flavor had been drained from the story, gum that had been chewed tasteless without being spat out. Because of that, no one treated us like cousins. My cousin never saw it that way though. When Daryl and his family moved into my town, we were treated like twins, which introduced an element of competition between the two of us. An inevitable game of comparison, perpetuated by our parents. A game that I consistently won. Not that I was looking to beat him at anything. I was just living my life. As a kid, Daryl was quiet, reserved and a little socially awkward, but overall considered polite and well-behaved. That disposition was a mask that he put on for everyone but me. In mixed company, my cousin was a bashful titan. Despite his bumpy start in this life, he well surpassed my lanky frame before we were even toilet trained. I shrugged my shoulders and swiveled my head side to side, tears welling in my eyes. But when we were alone, he dropped the act, and I got to see the strange hate that festered behind it all. "Why did you pull me out?" he said, shoving an 8-year-old me to the floor of his bedroom. "You know what I mean, Lenny. I was floating in the jelly, minding my own business. I wasn't hurting you. I wasn't hurting anyone. But you pulled me out, reached inside what wasn't yours and pulled me out. And now, I'm wrong. I feel wrong all the time. My heart beats backwards, not forwards. Part of my head is still in the jelly, and that hurts. The ink follows me. I can see it with my blind eye. Wakes me up at night. Why did you do it?" I don't get what you mean. Wiping the snot under my nose with the sleeve of my sweatshirt. Thankfully, as we aged, I gained agency over my life. If I didn't want to be alone with Daryl, that was my choice. Once I was in high school, no one would just plop us in a room, close the door, and ask us to play nice. Every interaction I had with Daryl with no one else around was like this. Nonsense accusations paired with threats of physical violence. I dreaded the occasions where he'd be capable of getting me alone. Holidays, birthdays, family reunions, they all inspired a burning, unspeakable worry that would smolder in my chest like a hot lump of coal. Eventually, my unhinged cousin became a distant trauma, fading into the white noise of adult life. I moved out, went to college, then to law school, got a good job, paid for a nice condo with the money from that job. After all that, she'd tell me how proud of me she was, and how she would brag to her friends about how much I made of myself. From what my mom would tell me, Daryl still lived at home, worked at a car wash, still reserved, still quiet, nice, still pleasant enough. Got in with the wrong crowd though, apparently. Nothing to do with drugs, violence, or sex. It was something else. Despite being a notorious gossip, Mom never gave me any details. All she ever told me was that it was really scaring my aunt. She'd never directly say it, but Mom only ever told me she was proud after expounding on how much of a fuck-up Daryl was. The implication was loud and clear. I was great, but I was especially great compared to my cousin, and that meant she was better than our aunt. I hated my mom's toxic pride. I pursued a career as a lawyer because I liked it, and it fulfilled me. But that didn't make me any better than Daryl. Life is not a game of prestige. It felt fucked up to enjoy my position that much more on account of Daryl being seen as societally deficient, even if he tormented me as a child. I hoped that whatever he was doing, however he was living his life, he was happy. When Daryl arrived on my doorstep with the tin of needles in his hand, I hadn't seen or heard from him in over a decade. More than that though, I hated the comparison because it linked me with him. I just wanted to be my own person, left alone. 911, what's your emergency? Once he lost consciousness, I reached my uninjured hand into his jacket pocket to retrieve my phone. As I was stepping out the front door, escorted by one of the EMTs, I noticed something violently peculiar. Next to Daryl's body, face now pale and blue from the blood loss, I spied the lid of the black tin lying next to his hand. But it looked different. What I saw made no earthly sense. Initially, I attributed the discordance to a false memory. But I know now that what I noticed had significance, even if I still don't understand exactly what that significance was, as I type this. Minutes later, the EMTs rushed into my apartment and took over the resuscitation efforts, which was a tremendous relief. Between the shock, the terror, and the broken wrist, I'm sure my one-handed CPR was piss poor at best. The golden design that had been present on the tin only 10 minutes prior was now gone, vanished like it had never been there in the first place. Finally, I'd be left alone. Hours later, discharged from the emergency room, wrist newly casted, I thought it was all over. I felt like I was free from him. He was dead, so the link was broken. Maybe even because of his death. A sacrifice for a curse. I was sorely mistaken. Whatever Daryl had done, it continued despite his death. Truthfully though, it wasn't a request. I was going to the station one way or the other. It was just a matter of how I was getting there, and what shape I wanted to arrive in. I elected to avoid whatever force they had in mind if I refused, and accompanied them to their idling sedan. A day later, I opened my apartment door to find 2 detectives standing outside. They instructed me to follow them to their car. I needed to answer a few questions about my cousin's death, and they requested I answered those questions at the police station. I was the prime suspect in Daryl's murder, and the detectives were looking for a confession. I wasn't sure what they planned on asking me. Daryl arrived unannounced to my apartment, pulled my phone away from me before I could call 911, and then proceeded to ingest handfuls upon handfuls of sharp needles until he died from the internal bleeding. I didn't know much more than that. To my complete and absolute bewilderment, I was placed in an interrogation room when we arrived at the station. "Listen, we know you did this, Lenny," one detective shouted, slamming a hairy fist onto the metal table. "What the fuck are you talking about? He swallowed the goddamned needles."
Yes.
"But," started the other detective, "you made him do it." I leaned back in my chair, wide-eyed, stunned into silence. These detectives were lunatics. A second later, the hairy-fisted detective parroted the statement, the same statement that Daryl had made right before he died. That changed when I called my mother from the station's pay phone. "Yes, you made him do it." Initially, I wasn't worried, disturbed by the outlandish accusation. Sure, but not worried. I went to law school. They had zero evidence, and I had no motive. None of it made a lick of sense. What was there to be concerned about? "I can't believe you made him do that." Numbly, I hung up, listening to her tiny static wails as I placed the phone back on the hook. "Lenny," she sobbed into the receiver. "The judge considered me a flight risk, and therefore refused to offer bail. So, I remained there, trapped in the county jail, indicted for Daryl's murder, with the only evidence against me, the unanimous belief that I made him do it. He made him do it. I just know it. The trial was a sham, an absolute fucking travesty of justice. I watched in horror as the prosecution called friends and family to the stand, who all had the same thing to say, an unending parade of baseless insanity. When it was the defense's turn, my lawyer didn't even bother to call me to the stand. He just ceded to the prosecution. "Even I know Lenny made him do it," he claimed. The judge then denied my request for self-representation. "We find the defendant guilty." After 3 days of that, the jury didn't even leave the room to deliberate. They looked at each other, shook their heads in near unison, and delivered their verdict. "He'll save you all the details of my attempts to fight back. It's unnecessary, and will only rile me up." I think, at this point it would be obvious what the response was. The gavel banged against the wood, its sound reverberating around the room like church bells before a hanging, and the bailiff ushered me out the door. Without a second thought, the judge handed down his sentencing. 20 years to life. May God have mercy on your soul. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've spent my days adjusting to the nuances of a maximum security prison, appealing my verdict, and attempting to figure out what the hell Daryl did to everyone. So far, no luck on any front. Courts have universally denied my appeals. Prison has been a near impossible adjustment. I still don't understand the mechanics of what my cousin has done to me. Not one bit. A loud tapping jolted me awake. The familiar sound of a baton rapping on the closed window at the top of my cell door continued as I rubbed sleep from my eyes. Then, there was what happened a few nights ago. One of the correction officers then pulled down the cover, revealing only his chin. He called my name, demanding I report to the door, despite the fact that it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning. Something was off. I dangled my feet off the top bunk, lowering myself carefully onto the floor below, hoping not to incur my cellmate's wrath by waking him up. He was a light sleeper. In my groggy state, I misjudged the distance to the floor, rattling the bunk beds as I fell. My cellmate didn't wake up. Not to the tapping, not to me falling, not to the miniature earthquake that traveled through the metal bed frame as I attempted to soften my fall. I pulled myself up and tiptoed towards the door. As I approached, I couldn't see the particular CO that was standing outside. There was just a disembodied jaw smiling at me through the partition. You do understand now, don't you, Lenny? When he spoke again, it wasn't with the same voice he had used to call me over. Daryl, how? I stuttered. I'd recognize that terrible melody anywhere. It's a tune that bounced against the inside of my skull like a pinball, day in and day out. One more chance, Lenny. Do you understand? In an instant, my heart raced and my blood began to boil. Sweat poured down my face. A veritable supernova of anger was rushing to the surface. Fury that I had suppressed while I pleaded my innocence, trying to appear harmless. When it bloomed, I had no hope of controlling it. When he responded, I think he said something like, "Fuck you, Daryl." I screamed, battering my fists against the steel door until they bled. I couldn't help myself. That sentence exploded out of my mouth, again and again, hoping my undead cousin on the other side of the threshold would suffocate on the steam my screams created, killing him a second time. All right, Lenny, let's try this again. But I can't be 100% sure. I was lost in an endless maze of pain and confusion. Whatever was on the other side of the door closed the window latch and walked away. As it clicked, my cellmate began to yowl, gripping his stomach with both hands and falling out of bed. It took about a minute for the real prison guards to hear his agony. During that time, I was confined in a small concrete box with the shrieking man. I looked around my cell, and I imagined that I was trapped inside Daryl's black tin. If I squinted, I could even see the golden stars and spirals that had disappeared from the lid of the tin, littering the walls like an intricate mural or the incoherent scribbling of a madman. As I watched him curl up into the fetal position and roll around the floor, I found myself imagining something strange. My cellmate died that night, ruptured ulcer in his stomach, acid exploding over his intestines like a water balloon. They told me I made it happen. Naturally, the prison decided it was my fault. Looks like he'll be sentenced to another 20 years, maybe more. I'm posting this from the prison's computer lab to see if anyone outside my immediate orbit is unaffected by whatever Daryl has done. What's happening to me? Or the next time Daryl appears? Do I just tell him that I understand? Even though I don't, how do I escape it? And God, I don't think I ever will. I am ready to talk about Jessica Lottie. I am ready to talk about the Antler King. I grew up in Iowa, right on the border of Nebraska. From ages 8 to 18, I bounced around foster care like a punched pinball without a case. But in a lot of ways, my life didn't start until my stint in foster care. I recall almost nothing before my first day at the Rothers house. It's the only life I've ever known. Whatever happened during those years before are burrowed deep into my brain, probably for the best. Not that my time in foster care felt better. It was a washing machine of rejection set to permanent press. Yet, for all the pain I picked up during that time, without it, I wouldn't have gotten a scholarship from FC2S to attend UNO. Go Huskers. Without it, I would have never met Jessica Lottie. I know what you are thinking. Sad sack with a dark past meets a girl at a college bar. She's a psych major who learned the ways to mend a broken heart, and he's the injured bird who flew into town. He sees her from across the room through the smog of half-burned cigarettes and knows she is the light at the end of his tunnel. He saunters up to her, cool, dark, mysterious, and coordinated. He whisks her off her feet and into the sheets. But it wasn't like that. Jessica wasn't like that. I didn't find her, didn't choose her. She chose me. Hey, she said between short, tired breaths. I looked up from my shaded reading spot, squinting against the Nebraska sun to glimpse whoever was talking to me. Silhouetted against the abusive rays was a tall girl with a taller personality, her hands on her hips like a superhero. She shined with fresh sweat in bright purple athletic attire. She gobbled up breaths and smeared snot off her nose while she untangled her blonde hair from a haphazard ponytail. Without mincing words, she was an utter mess. "Hi," I said. "Jessica, we're going to be late." A voice, who I'd later come to know as Denise, shouted from behind her. "Go on without me," she said, never looking back. I geared my book and closed it, unsure whether to stand or not. Her closeness destabilized me. I was instantly unsure of myself around her, a feeling that wouldn't dissipate until a year into our relationship. Then, she'd throw a pillow at my head and tell me to hurry up and get over this melancholy weirdness. But on that day, I didn't know whether to demand space or adopt the fetal position. I sat there with mouth agape like a Venus flytrap. Jessica didn't mind. She paid little attention to how people reacted to her. It was her way. She was a river. You either were on a boat and enjoyed the ride or were just another rock in the stream for her to crash over. "Do I know you?" I asked. My throat was locked in a vice. I was increasingly aware of how similar our sweat levels had become over our short interaction. "No, you don't," she said, stretching to her toes. She grabbed the balls of her feet, exposing corded calf muscles and a striated back. She upturned her head to me, smiling. "But I'd like to get to know you." At this point, it felt a little too much like a Hallmark movie. I assumed my roommate had put her up to this, another part of his ever-frustrated plan to get me out of my shell. "Did Tyler?" She closed the distance and crouched down to my level. We were inches away now. I could almost taste the salt from her sweat. I've rewritten this paragraph a couple of times to try to capture that moment. I end up short each time. My time in foster care was defined by the way people looked at me. Pity pickled empathy. Disgust. I'd seen it all through the veneer of politeness. But never had I been more seen than in Jessica's eyes. Two sharp green headlights that cut through the fog of doubt and unfamiliarity between us, shining a light on who we were and who we were to be. Her stare killed the words in my throat. I never was adopted, never knew that feeling, but Jessica could swaddle you with a look. In that one fleeting moment, I knew what it felt to be picked, to be loved, to be safe. "Can I be honest for a second?" she said. I didn't have a response. An invitation for her to continue. I never sent, but she took anyway. "I saw you on my first lap. I thought, I wonder who that cute boy is." Then I continued to think that. "Do you know how many miles I've run so far?" 8. "You're still there, rummaging around." Okay. Smooth. "You probably think I'm crazy, but I don't like masks. I rip them right off. I'm drawn to you. I'm not sure why, but I want to find out." She put a hand on mine. My skin roiled. My brain thundered commands, demanding me to run. Something was wrong. Fight or flight had kicked in. It was as if we were surrounded by candlelight, cutting a portal through the dark, and I had become acutely aware of the monsters which lay within. I don't know what monsters she locked away with her touch. All I knew is they were never farther than in that moment. "I'm not sure what to say. Say you want my number, and you are free Friday." I took her advice. I'm glad I did. Even now, when writing this out, makes me wish I was knee-deep in a bottle of Buffalo Trace and back in rehab. We were together for 3 years. There is a lot I could tell you all about that time, but I won't. With my memory issues, I've become weirdly protective of them. My moments with her are the clearest I've had. I fear sharing them. Taking them off the shelf and out of their protective glass will wear the paint off my mind, and they'll be lost. But I do want to share a few things to help you get a more complete picture of Jessica. She was the kind of person to run into oncoming traffic to save an injured and still actively spraying skunk. I watched her put some douche canoe into an armbar after he touched Denise's shoulder at Neighbors and said, "You'd looked good on my face." But what I hold dearest was little moments, like the time we watched some sappy rom-com, my request not hers, and she kissed me on the cheek and said, "I'm sorry you had to hide your laugh for so long." The shift in her behavior started on October 14th. Jessica loved horror. She'd watch Monster of the Week films, knew the script to Scream by heart, toted around a vintage Scooby-Doo lunchbox, Would even rank her iterations if you inquired. The live-action ones rated higher than I thought appropriate, but even our soulmates can have flaws. A local store of ours was shutting down and held a 90% flash sale to clear out their stock. When I mentioned it, Jessica lit up almost as bright as the day I proposed. Before we could discuss it further, she was out the door, half covered in mismatched clothes and a toothbrush askew in the corner of her mouth. "You think that's in good taste?" I asked. "Is anything on Halloween in good taste?" She said, cradling the zombie baby. She looked good as a mom, still a bit daring. Jesus was the first zombie, Al. She snorted, uplifting Jesus in a Lion King-like fashion. Closer inspection revealed Bill may have made it himself with a splatter of green paint and a Chucky doll head. "I see buying this as paying tribute to our great Lord." "Fine," I chuckled. "Just remember how much space you have in your dorm. I don't think Denise is going to appreciate living in a haunted house for another semester." She didn't slow at my protestations. A pair of skeletons mid-waltz joined the horde. "We will just have to start looking at houses early then." My heart stopped. We'd been engaged for 3 months, but college had had this illusory effect on the depth of our relationship. All of our life seemed so movie-like. Talks of a home and marriage were grounded. It ripped me out of the fantasy. With each milestone we passed in our relationship, the forest of life was more mapped. We were voyagers out of the known territory of adolescence and moving onto the true blue thicket of adulthood. "It needs to be a big house too. I'm gonna need room for all this crap," she shouted as she darted down the aisle, mushing her cart to a breakneck speed before drifting it around the corner, tossing in the occasional macabre bobble along the way. With the beast satiated, I decided to conduct my search. The halls of Bill's were dense. Imagine an overrun forest cloistered over a small dirt path. Replace the path with rotted linoleum tiles, and the canopy of trees with shelves bloated with ghouls, ghasts, and undead trinkets. And you are right there. I even had to side shimmy at one point to make it through the density of the witch section. After a duck walk past the chandelier of knives, I crested through and found myself in an alcove haphazardly formed by the store shelves. I would have thought I had stumbled into another world if I couldn't hear Jessica's giggles beyond the shelf to my right. "It even shoots blood," she screamed, mechanical whirling and gushing, chasing her words produced by whatever shot blood. I smiled and combed through the racks in front of me. Costumes and masks from cult classics like The Wolfman to newer, less great films like The Nun packed the hangers. Jessica had been looking for a creature from the Black Lagoon mask for some time, but had made specific requests, comments about the color. Something about how it had to be darker because a different one was used during the water scenes. I don't know, but that's what I searched for when I stumbled upon the deer mask. I had parted the clothing rack enough to expose the wall behind it. There, atop a single wall hook, was a paint-weathered orange deer skull sewn to a black cowl. Some might have called it a Wendigo mask, but the Ojibwe Wendigo were more akin to frozen cannibals. Besides, it wasn't the impression the mask gave. The bleached white antlers had holes drilled through various places along the tines. Thin gold chains fed through the holes and enshrined across the tips to form a circlet. What I remember most was how much I wanted to pick it up, not in some kind of cursed object way, but how you might grab a ball or a TV remote you have fiddled with before. I picked up the mask and tossed it into the cart without much thought. I added a few more bits and bobs before I met back up with Jessica at the register. She had loaded piles of tombstones, grim garments, and caustic brews onto the counter. Even Bill looked shocked. As soon as she saw me with my sparse card, her smile died. "You disappear, and this pile is all you have to show for it. Weak, Truman. Weak. Disappear." She pursed her lips. "You were gone for about 45 minutes. Bill didn't even see where you went." That sounded way too long. We had just separated, but I put it out of my mind. "Sorry," I said. "I must have lost track of time. Looking for that Black Lagoon mask. No dice. Think I got one in the back if you want me to look." Bill chimed in, a glint of hopefulness in his eyes. I knew the second that man walked away, he'd return with no lagoon mask, and instead a pile of things he'd think Jessica would buy for his discount. Was it a part of the 73 production series? If so, I'm definitely interested. She leaned on the counter. Seeing that Bill had no idea and was only keen to make a sale, I tried to distract Jessica with my trove. Or, you could take a look at this crazy thing instead. I bent over and donned the cowl. I was all but blind in it. The portion of the mask that extended down and covered the eyes was thick burlap or canvas that had been painted black. Only the edges of details were discernible. I stood up in my best Dracula stance, even held an invisible cloak, and turned to Jessica. "How do I look?" I said in my plainest, Midwestern voice. Everyone always expects Eastern European. "Oh man," Jessica said. "Where did you dig that thing up, Bill? We adding roadkill to the collection?" Bill hummed for a moment. "Not sure, actually. May have been a local drop-off. Some of my stuff is from the early 90s. Lots of hobbyists came in and tried to pawn off their spooky junk during that time." I reached out to Jessica with zombie-like arms. She squealed. She stifled her laugh and made, what I could hardly discern through my poor view, a serious face. "Are you a vampire or a zombie? You need to pick one here. It's the law." She got close and analyzed the face. "Seems much more regal than monster-like. Wonder what all the gold is about." I pulled the mask off and studied it. "I don't know. It does seem a little royal, huh? King-like." When I looked back at her, Jessica's face was twisted and wrong. Her eyes twitched, blinking in rapid bursts. Her smile was on stilts, and her eyes wet. At first I thought it was the air quality. Bill's place wasn't ventilated, and a miasma of dust had stirred to a full devil since we had arrived. But then I heard the squeaking of soles on the linoleum. She inched towards the door. "Jess, you okay?" She coughed, strangled down a small yelp, and backed away further. Her other hand jittered, trying to conceal efforts to find the door. "No. Yes. I am fine. Just got cold all of a sudden. I'm going to grab some air. Can you get all this stuff loaded up?" Before I could agree, she crashed into the glass door and threw it open, running. Bill and I shared a look of bewilderment before I tossed the mask into my cart with the rest of the things I had selected. I opted to take only Jessica's item for brevity's sake. When I got to the truck, I stopped dead in my tracks. Jessica was in front of the Ranger's driver's side window, eyeing her reflection. She shook fast enough to get a hypothermia diagnosis. Her eyes radiated hate. It was as if she were trying to melt the glass. Then, I heard her whisper under her breath. "Not one, two, not one, two. Can't take this little piggy to market. The bacon's already sold." "Jessica, you okay?" Her hands snapped to her head. "There's just no room," she screamed. Suddenly, she threw open the door of the Ranger and slammed it. She did this in a loop while she screamed the same phrase. "There's just no room." She couldn't have done this for more than 20 seconds, but we waded through the bog of that moment in years. When I came to my senses, I ran to her. She flailed, catching me with a stray slap. It rocked my vision like Mike Tyson had skin-walked in place of my fiancé. I crashed onto the pavement. When I looked up, her head was cinched in her hands, like she was preventing it from flying away. She was bent over at the waist, eyes fixated on the ground and shaking around their sockets. Then her gaze snapped to me. Her confused expression curdled into a horrid amalgamation of pain wrinkles and angry tears. "No room." Then she threw up. A bottomless stream of bile roared from within her. The smell of acrid eggs and rotten waffles wafted throughout the parking lot and straight to the back of my throat. I stumbled to my feet to comfort her, hold her hair, rub her back, or something. When the edge of my fingers made contact with her blouse, she snapped upright and shoved me flat on my ass again. "Don't fucking touch me," she screamed through gurgled bursts of bile. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to get help," I said, or tried to. Well, my voice was gone. She had never spoken to me that way, never acted that way. I want to pretend I rushed to her side, strong and confident like some action hero. I didn't. I crumbled beneath my fear. Sure, she was acting strange, but in a way tailor-made to torment me. Her display had unearthed some crawler under the rock of my soul. I just froze. "No," she said in between spurts of yellow ichor. "I'm fine." After a moment she finished. Eventually my legs worked again, and I eased past her to the Ranger, half expecting her to slap me down once more. She didn't move, only dragged in large gulps of air and spat out the foul residue. I fished out some paper towels. Wincing in anticipation, I handed her a bundle. When she took them, her hands were soft in both touch and demeanor, replaced from what she was a moment ago. "I'm sorry, Al," she said. Her cheeks were blotched red from her tears and her hair clumped around her brow. She smiled, but she still didn't look at me. I don't know what came over me. A fucking demon if I had to guess. Jesus, Jess, are you okay? What was that? Yeah, it felt like all of my guts wanted to jump out of me. Real exorcist moment. She let out a small chuckle. With how things went, I should have pressed harder. I should have dug deeper, but I was drenched in fear. Part of me didn't want Jessica to see how scarred I had been, but a more selfish part didn't want to tug on the thread of why. I had no idea what about her display resonated with me, but I was staring at a locked door, and I knew I needed to knock, both as her boyfriend and someone who needed to know what was on the other side. But when the avenue of ignorance opened up, I took it. "Let's just get you home," I said. "Yeah," she said. "Could just be bad clams." "You hate clams." "Shut up, Truman," she said, burping up stomach acid between her words. We laughed and things seemed to revert to normal. I helped her into the truck, slapped on some George Strait, and we drove back to her dorm. Idle chatter filled the drive. She even cracked a few jokes about what had happened. After some rough traffic and a couple of memes, it truly seemed behind us. When I got to her dorm, I unloaded her treasure trove, kissed her despite her concern over her truly disgusting breath, and made my way to leave. "See you tomorrow for breakfast?" I asked. She had crawled into bed and faced the wall like a child sent to bed. Her whole stature seemed smaller. At the edge of her bed, I towered over her, and I hated it. "If I am feeling better," she mumbled under her sheets. There the door was again, and again. I believed her, even if her weak voice conveyed no confidence. Tomorrow came, and I texted her the moment I awoke. "Hey Bean, still squirting?" I asked. She sent a few laughing emojis, but no response. After an hour, I just asked if she wanted me to bring her something to make her feel better. "Thanks," she replied, "but I don't want to get you sick. Denise thinks I need a medevac. Gonna get me soup." I tried to persuade her to let me get it, but she insisted otherwise, said whatever she had was going to kill her, and shed hate for me to get it. Those words in particular have my sobriety coin between my fingers like a rosary. I accepted her response and asked if she wanted to get me the course material from any of her classes. She said yes, and that shed send me a list after a nap. I didn't hear from her for the rest of the day. I called a few times until Denise answered. She told me Jessica had racked out at 3 o'clock and hadn't stirred since. I made her promise to let me know if she worsened so I could take her to the ER. I didn't trust Bill's place to not be ground zero for Nebraska's source of asbestos. She laughed but promised she would call. After a couple of hours of unease and worry, I fell asleep. I received a random text from Jessica at 3 in the morning. All it said was, "Deers can turn witches into salt." Denise never called. Almost sent Jessica a reply asking her what it meant, but she said she didn't know, and that she had intended to write that in her dream journal. Eventually, our conversation shifted, and I told her I'd be by after my morning classes, soup in hand, and would deliver it whether she liked it or not. She shot back a thumbs up. I arrived at her dorm at 10:30. It was empty. I stored her extra spicy pho hash, 5 her favorite, in her mini fridge, and took a look around. 2 things stood out to me. Firstly, her freshly acquired spooky goods were still packaged up, not entirely weird, but I had seen this girl marathon the Friday 13th series with a staph infection, notable if nothing else. The other was when I tried to give her a call. Her phone rang from her closet door. I followed the sound. Jessica was wacky in lots of ways, but not one to enjoy a closet nap. As the handle was in my grasp, the bolt slowly turning, I realized I hadn't hung up. Her Kim Possible ringtone bleated out as I pulled the door open. Hearing something so stupid, so childish, while my stomach roiled as a feeling I can't forget. This horrid entangling of the endearing and the endearing, trust and turmoil. I didn't know what was beyond the door, but part of me prepared for the worst. I flung it open, hard enough to thud against the interior wall. Jessica wasn't there. Sitting alone on the carpeted floor was her phone, a wastebasket full of tissues, and a kid's hairpin. I picked up her phone to silence the call, and picked up the hairpin out of happenstance. Some of you may not appreciate this, but I unlocked her phone. Jessica and I had long established permission for one another to do so, hence why I had the code, but I had hoped to see any texts or calls to indicate where she had gone. She hadn't sent any texts to Denise, but what I found was weird. She had placed 10 calls within the last 8 hours, 2 missed calls to her parents, and 8 to someone called Oatman. There was also 1 text to an unknown number. Whenever you are free, well meet. Oatman, I said. What are you doing? I fell forward out of shock, snatching onto Jessica's coat rack for stability, and snapped it out of place. I smashed my face into the closet wall. When I rolled over onto my back and looked up, Jessica was there. She stood in the doorway like an obstacle of shadow. Her eyes were sunken and puffy. Her shoulders, slouched so far down her spine, had been replaced with a cane. Her hair was matted. I smelled, even tasted, the air of yesterday's vomit off her. Oh my God, you scared me. Why are you in my closet? Her tone was cold, colder than I thought her capable. Your phone, when you weren't home. I called. It rang from in here. I thought you might have fallen asleep. In a closet? Yeah, I thought it was weird too. She said nothing. She sauntered up to me as if on wheels, reached down for the phone in my left hand and the hairpin in my right. She ushered them into hers and then went back to bed. She moved across the floor like on skates, all efforts calculated to mitigate as much movement as possible. I got up to my feet and sat in shock for a moment before the silent tension compelled me to speak. Who's Oatman? A friend. Just a friend, huh? I said, joking about infidelity, which wasn't funny, but neither was the situation. Regardless, she just rolled onto her side and looked at me in a way that said to let the question die. Were you meeting someone to sell something on campus? Nothing but the dull clicking of her ceiling fan broke the glass of quiet. It was a silence that made my heart ache. As more time went on, the guiltier I felt. I had no idea as to why my stomach turned. It was that damn door, between us once more, and I knew it was to blame. Her behavior had been odd since Bill's. Maybe it was because I suggested we go there. Somehow this sickness seemed like my fault, and I couldn't shake it. Almost in confirmation, she sat up suddenly and turned to me. Her face masked an undying rage. Do you want my whole schedule? First all these questions about my friends, and now you are reading my texts. She had a curt tone, but I pushed past it. We aren't our best all the time. I sat down on the bed next to her, but she scooted aside. No, I didn't mean it like that. How exactly did you mean it, Al? You think I am some cheating fucking whore? Jess, no. I just am sorry. I'm not trying to snoop. I'm worried about you. I went to brush her hair, but she withdrew. You should go. I placed my hands in my lap and bit my lip. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how. Each action of mine seemed to worsen things. Okay, I brought you your favorite soup. Not hungry. Have you eaten today? Silence. I sighed. Do you have the list of your classes? I can go there right now. She turned to me. Eyes cold, empty. It's as if I wasn't in the room. Don't worry about it. It's taken care of. What does that mean? Suddenly, her eyes focused. I was warped back from whatever distant world her stare had placed me in. A sheer moment of lucidity had kicked in. Whatever had consumed her throughout this time, she had broken free from. For a moment, I thought she would smile, laugh, and tell me this was all some prank. Instead, she ran past me to the bathroom, and wretched. From beyond the bathroom door, I heard manic sobbing as the bile left her. Her fist slammed upon the bathroom door, like she was trying to beat the sickness out of her floors. When she returned, she was braving a bold smile through tear-filled eyes. I'm sorry, honey. Whatever bug I picked up is taking a lot out of me. I'm feeling a bit better now. Relief washed over me. It's selfish, but the little light in the tunnel she offered me was such a blessing. The door had been locked in front of me, and like a fucking coward, I just accepted it. You don't need to apologize. I'm sorry. I feel like I am making this about me somehow. I just hate being so helpless. She placed a hand on my face. It's the worst feeling imaginable, isn't it? A dark so big and deep, you don't even know if you have eyes anymore. All you can do is say, goodbye. She kissed me. Her hand worked my belt. Each time I tried to stop, to talk, her passion increased. It overtook me. The wildness of it all had put me on island. Each attempt to get close had been rejected. This small connection had sucked me in. Desperate to return to our lives only a few days ago, she read me like a book. I see that now, that it was what she wanted. When we were done, we cuddled for the rest of the day. We watched a few movies. She ate half of her soup and perked up a bit. All the oddities had melted away in the small moments of bliss. Sometime in the evening, she took some medication. It lifted her spirits, but she was still in and out of the bathroom a lot, throwing up more than at Bill's. With how many meds she was taking, I grew concerned. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and committed to taking her to the ER. But when I returned to her room, she'd fallen asleep. I opted to wait for her to wake up, halfway through a Terry Pratchett book. The night took me too. I woke up in the pitch black of her room sometime later. I didn't know the time, but judging by how groggy I was, I assumed past midnight. I reached for my phone on her nightstand, and my hand thudded into something soft. It was Jessica, upright on the nightstand, clutching her knees and watching me like a gargoyle. In my half-lucid state, I wasn't sure she was there at all. Not because of how she was sitting, but because of what she was wearing. She sat there, naked all save for the deer mask from Bill's store, the one I never bought. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. I could hear the grinding of her teeth. My eyes focused, and I could see she had gripped her forearms hard enough to leave marks, even draw blood. "I've got magic beans to kill the big bad giant, but they make Jessica a dull boy," she said, rattling a bottle of pills. "Jessica." I tried to stand, but my legs were jelly. She shook her head, whipping her hair hard to the left and right, like a cartoon character. Oatman, protector of the night. He's who keeps the deer at bay." Terrified, I tried to get up, and she climbed atop me. "Don't worry, they help. Help give you what you want." "Stop." I shoved her off of me. She slammed into the wall beside her bed. Guilt washed over me. I didn't even think I pushed her that hard. I was halfway to standing when she arched herself up into a bridge. Her hair dangled upside down like rotted insulation. Her skin seemed pallid and dead. The only drop of color on her person was the fucking deer mask. "You don't want me," she screamed. "You picked me. You chose me." I thought I lost it. That this was all some dream. Was it whatever made her sick? Fever-induced mania? What kind of fucking sickness causes you to act like that? I just readied myself to wake up from whatever dream this was, when a dose of reality crashed on the other side of the dorm wall. "Just stick it in the girl already, so shell shut the fuck," a male voice thundered, hammering his fist against the wall. I backed up, working my way to the door. "Jessica, I don't know what is going on, but we need to get help." She stood from her arch as if pulled by invisible strings. "Then you can get the fuck out, Al." Her lucidity whipped me like a rubber band. It made me furious. I was trapped between a psychotic break and some sick joke. My fiancée, the strongest person I knew, was now no better than all the people in foster care. All those bastards who laid hands on you after they promised to care. I snapped. "Fuck you. You are acting like a lunatic. I don't know if it's because you are high on some magic beans or whatever, but we're leaving. You need a doctor, a psychologist, or a fucking exorcist." I expected her to be angry, furious, fight me, something. But she didn't. She got on her hands and knees and kissed my feet, whimpering like a dog who had been struck for stealing food. I'm sorry. Her voice had raised an octave, threatening all the glass in her dorm room. "Don't leave, Your Majesty. Please don't go. I hate when you close the door. I'll return the Forest of Times. I'll make you whole." My back hit the door. She was atop me in moments. I froze. She crawled up to me like a spider, smashed the cowl of the mask into my face, and licked me through the burlap. For the good of the kingdom. Everything she said, every word, every action, every tear she cried, and all the begging, strung a chord deep within the well of my soul. All those desires to run, my insecurity, bubbled up like an overflown septic tank. I would have fallen apart right there if Denise hadn't opened the door and caused me to fall into the safe, musty air of the hallway. I spilled out, gasping. Jessica towered over me like an effigy of her former self. She smiled, but her eyes were fountains of silent tears. "You two love birds having a good time. Denise asked, fiddling in her bag and not yet appraising the situation. I pulled Denise into the hallway and slammed the door. Jessica didn't react. I drew frantic breaths. Then she started to knock. A light knock that could be confused for a mouse's footsteps. What the hell, Al? Denise, I don't know what the fuck is going on, but Jessica is, I don't know, possessed or something. Maybe high. Drugs from that fucking Oatman guy. The hell is an Oatman? Some fucking guy in her phone. I assume who gave her these. Denise took the pills from me and looked to the door. Oh no, she sighed. Whatever she said, don't hold it against her. These are some heavy downers. Downers? She was standing like a fucking monster at the edge of the bed. Look, just go home. I've dealt with a lot of dudes on these kinds of trips. I'll mellow her out and give you a call in the morning. But I know you want to do the right thing, Hal, but pushing the issue with someone who is blasted out of their gourd is never a good idea, man. Trust me. I took one last look at the door and relented. Denise would be with her, and once she was sober, we'd figure it out. People do these drugs all the time. Jessica wasn't going crazy. She just was having a rough couple of days and tripping on whatever meds she took to feel better. That's all. That's what I told myself over the next couple of hours until my body gave out and I fell asleep. I was asleep for maybe 40 minutes before my ringtone woke me. I snatched my phone open. My lips were dry enough to be Velcro, sticking and peeling away from each other. I need to get over here. What's going on? I shouted, darting to my truck. Just hurry, something's wrong. Jessica. Don't. The sound of crashing glass erupted through the receiver. I sped across campus until I was right in front of her dorm. My tires squealed to a halt. I threw on my hazards and abandoned my truck. I yanked my keys, but pulled the spare out from the sun visor and threw it on the dash. If someone needed to move it, steal it for all I cared, they could. When I rounded the hallway to Jessica's room, I saw Denise standing there, clutching her phone in terror. A small gathering of students had filtered out from their rooms. A couple were mid-discussion about calling campus security. I could see why. The hallway was littered with broken things. Shattered glass, pieces of a vase, lights, a lamp or two, the decorations from yesterday. Wasn't until I was next to Denise that I noticed the commonality of all the items. They were all things we'd gotten together. Is she still high? I asked Denise, unaware I had begun to whisper. No, she's not fucking high. I woke her up. She tells me she was feeling better and even apologizes for her loopy bullshit. Then she sees a photo of you two on her desk, zones out, and starts freaking the fuck out. I peeked into the room as Denise spoke. Jessica was on her bed, head on her knees, rocking back and forth. Did you two break up or something? What? No. Just stay here. I inched towards the door. Smashed bits of glass and memories crunched underneath my feet. Jessica didn't react when I entered, but as I got closer I noticed she was saying something underneath her breath. A witch. Jess. By the time I got to her bedside, she was clear. An audio loop of an asylum patient played straight into my brain. I still hear it. Not a witch. I reached out for her, and she launched at me. I fell to the ground. My head crashed into the floor. A sharp piece of glass nicked the back of my head. Blood surged from the wound and into the dorm carpet. Then she was atop me, beating my chest with all her might. Her fists slammed down on my ribcage, like she were a predator vying to break through a shell for the meat inside. Each strike crumbled my heart beneath. Not a witch. I'm not a witch. I'm not a witch. She wailed. Fervent spit rained on my face. I tried to restrain her, to hold her, but she fought me. She punched me in the face hard enough that I saw stars. Her dorm mates flooded in to get her off of me. Don't hurt her, I shouted, more worried about what she might do than them. Jessica, it's okay. Then, her anger broke into tears. She went limp in our arms. All the will to fight was gone in an instant. I went to her, fearful of her like one might be to a wild animal. But when my hands reached her, she didn't snap, didn't beat me, didn't attack. She just looked at me. I'm sorry. She choked out through the sobs. I'm so sorry. She ran. I darted after her. staggering from my beating and across the chaos strewn about the floor. I was hot on her tail, but Jess was a runner, and I was a fucking book nerd. By the time I had gotten down the stairs, I saw the taillights of my Ranger speed out of the parking lot. The cold autumn wind bit me as I watched her leave. I slapped my person for my keys. Then, I remembered the dash and fell to my knees. I pulled out my phone to call, but she never answered. I called and called, but she never returned. Friends didn't know where she went. I stayed up for 48 hours straight, searching all of our favorite places, anywhere that might have a trace of her. Nothing. Then at 3 a.m. the following night, she called. "Hello?" I said, ripping myself from a dream where she hadn't left. "Hey, Truman," she groaned. "Jess, where are you? Oh God, Jess, please tell me you are okay. Please tell me where you are." Silence for a while. Then, a raspy voice returned to the line. "I know you think I am crazy, but I'm not. I just remembered." And she started to cry. "Whatever it is, I'll help. I'll make it better. I'll be better." "You've done enough," she spat. I didn't know what it meant, but she didn't give me a chance to ask. They walk, Al. They walk through the pines like little princes, and I just remembered. I am one of the princesses who got away, and they know I know, and I'm not going back. Jess, where are? I love you. She hung up. I called for 3 days straight, only stopping to call the police. Jessica wasn't close with her family, but none of her friends heard from her. I put out missing notices all across the town and campus. Got in touch with the news. A 4-month-long man hunt for Jessica Lottie rocked the Midwest. It would have gone on longer had I not received her letter in the mail, penned on the stationery of Dr. Benjamin E. Quaker of Plainview, Nebraska. Oatman, reading his name. I wasn't convinced he was real. When I looked up his practice on Google Maps, it showed a barren parking lot, but Plainview was close. The thought of her being so close, yet so far, sundered my heart. Reading her note, reading how much she loved me hurt, but still decided to follow through with her plan, is what led me to down the spiral. Won't share the details of those beautifully horrid 5 pages. Those are for me, and the bastard Wedgell did this. I'm armed with a 3-month sobriety chip, a failed college degree, and a Glock 43. No one believes me about my fiancé's suicide. They think I am exaggerating how different she had become. They kept telling me there were signs, and we missed them. That Jessica was putting on a brave face. That the drugs played a part. Bullshit. There is something else going on here. Something bigger than a big girl with a brave mask. They weren't there. They didn't see the whole picture. They didn't read her suicide note. They didn't read its last line. "I'm sorry, Al. I can't hold this in anymore. There's just not enough room. It's not your fault. It never was. It was always the Antler King." The midnight gas station. He stood behind the counter. Jim was bored beyond belief. He hated working the night shift. He was always tired and bored. He kept turning to stare at the clock every once in a while. He was waiting for 1 a.m. His co-worker Jerry was also meant to get off at 1. However, he felt ill, so he went home early. With no one to entertain him, he just waited. At around 10:30, a car pulled up. The driver stepped out and began to move towards the entrance to the gas station. He looked slightly drunk. He picked up a bag of chips and a soda, and then he walked to the counter. "Just this, please," he said. "No problem," said Jim. The man paid the $5 he owed and then left. His car drove slowly out of the space he parked in. The vehicle vanished into the night. Jim sat down. He wanted to leave, just forget the customers and go home. But he couldn't leave now, and he'd be fired. He lowered his head down and slept. Then, it got weird. At 11:25, a woman bolted through the door. She woke Jim from his slumber. She looked panicked. She looked around and saw Jim. She walked over while constantly checking the windows. Hello. Can you please call the police?" Jim rubbed his eyes. "I'm sorry. Phone's busted. It had been vandalized by a drunkard the previous night. Well, can I at least stay here for a bit?" She was on the verge of tears. "Why? What is happening? Someone, or something, has been following me for ages. My car stalled down the road. That's when I saw it. It looked like me. I'm not bullshitting. I swear. Jim looked worried now. She stared outside. She began to cry. Before he could comfort her, she was gone. The automatic door shut. Jim felt scared about this encounter. But what could he do now? Call the police? No, of course not. He kept waiting. Then, it got really weird. At midnight, exactly something came through the door. Jim was asleep once again. It tapped him on the shoulder. He looked up. It was not the woman from earlier. She grinned maniacally. Its eyes were morose, normal yet able to look in impossible directions. Jim woke. Before he could speak, it stopped him with its voices. It sounded like 5 people speaking in unison, yet disjointed and choppy. You saw nothing. Go to sleep. Jim's lip quivered as it ejected itself out the door and slinked into the darkness. Safe to say he never worked the night shift again. Blood and shadows. The night raid. Ilaris woke to distant screams, her heart pounding as if trying to escape her chest. For a split second, she thought it was just another nightmare. She'd had plenty since finding the carnage at Whisperglade's gates. Then she realized her eyes were already open. She hadn't been fully asleep, just drifting in a shallow doze beneath the cedar where she and Feren had sheltered. Night pressed down on the forest. Every distant wail cut through the silence, like a blade. Feren, the wounded elf Shed found cowering among broken crates, stirred beside her. Shed bandaged his shoulder, but he was far from healed. He jolted awake at the screams, breath hitching. What's happening? He gasped, eyes wild with fear. Ilaris shook her head, pulse racing. I don't know. I thought they'd moved on. She glanced at the patch of sky, visible through the canopy. Moonlight cast the cedars in ghostly silhouettes, but couldn't show her what lurked beyond. Minutes earlier, Shed thought the village attack had ended. Whisperglade lay ravaged, bodies scattered in the streets, the stench of blood heavy in the air. Shed crept away with Feren, hoping only to survive until morning, to search for traces of her missing mother and sister in daylight. But now the screams rang out again, closer. The vampires were still nearby. Her veins flooded with adrenaline. She stood, grabbing her bow. Stay here, she told Feren, voice low but steady. I need to see what's happening. His hand shot out, gripping her forearm. No, don't go back. They'll kill you. People are still alive in there. Maybe refugees who'd hidden during the first attack, or victims just now discovered by the vampire thralls. Either way, she couldn't listen to those cries and do nothing. Her father's face flashed in her mind. Her failure to save him gnawed at her, fueling a fierce determination. Feren exhaled shakily but released her. Just, be careful. She nodded. If I'm not back soon, find somewhere deeper in the woods. I don't want both of us caught if it's a trap. He looked like he wanted to protest but said nothing. Instead, he pulled his makeshift bandage tighter and pressed himself against the cedar trunk, trying to blend with the shadows. Ilaris ducked under a low branch and slipped into darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to tread lightly. The forest felt taut, charged with dread. She remembered how quickly the vampires had sensed her before, and how narrowly Shed escaped. The memory of red eyes and blood-stained teeth made her skin crawl. Yet, she kept going, drawn by the echoes of terrified screams. The path back to Whisperglade was marked with broken branches and deep footprints, evidence of the earlier rampage. Her boots made almost no sound on the leaf-strewn ground, a skill honed from years of hunting. She paused at the forest edge, pressing against a thick pine as she studied the village perimeter. The scene turned her stomach. The vampire onslaught hadn't ended. Large columns of smoke curled into the night sky, orange-tinted by flames. Several buildings inside Whisperglade burned, their thatched roofs collapsing as sparks arced into darkness. Shrieks split the air. Along the main street, shadowy figures sprinted, some desperately fleeing, others in relentless pursuit. Horror washed through her as she realized the vampires were cleaning up, making sure no survivors remained. They're gathering stragglers or anyone who was hiding. She swallowed hard, steadying her trembling hands around the bow. Summoning her courage, She moved toward the battered south gate, where splintered wooden planks hung from the gatehouse. Flickers of flame lit the entire perimeter, making it dangerous to approach unseen. But Alaris stuck to darkness, finding shadow pockets behind toppled carts and collapsed fences. Occasionally, she caught the swirl of a black cloak or heard a thrall's hiss. The vampires moved through chaos like predators in a feeding ground. A child's scream pierced the night from somewhere inside the village. Alaris clenched her jaw, anger and terror coiling in her gut. She had to do something. She nocked a silver-tipped arrow, one of her few remaining ones. If she could distract or kill a thrall, maybe at least one victim could escape. But how many vampires were there? She counted at least 4 or 5 shapes moving among the burning homes. Flames jumped from building to building, thatched roofs, igniting swiftly. Smoke thickened the air, stinging her eyes. Bow ready, she crept into the main street. The bodies she'd seen earlier were still there, some half-burned, others being dragged away by gaunt thralls. She forced back her revulsion. The vampires wanted no trace left. Ahead, she spotted Whisperglade's communal hall, once a gathering place for festivals. Now its double doors stood wide open, fire flickering inside. She heard frantic shouts. Someone was trapped. Just as she prepared to move closer, the doors slammed shut. A pale figure in a ragged cloak appeared, holding the door with one arm while grinning at the screams from within. This thrall was different from the others she'd glimpsed, taller, with a face that retained traces of aristocratic features beneath its monstrous pallor. It wore tattered finery, as if it had once been noble before turning. A strange pattern of ritual scars marked its exposed throat, visible even in the dim light. Ilaris' heart hammered. She aimed, drawing the bowstring taut. The thrall's attention was fixed on the hall, unaware of her. Her arms tensed as she released. The arrow sped through smoky air and hit its mark. A choked snarl burst from the thrall as the arrow sank deep into its back. It spun around, releasing the door. The screams inside intensified, and Alaris saw a frantic group, 2 adults and a young boy, burst through the doorway. Their clothes were singed, the boy crying. They ran into the street, terror in their eyes. The thrall locked onto the fleeing survivors. Alaris knocked another arrow fast, but the vampire whirled with inhuman speed, lunging for the boy. "No!" she shouted, loosing her second arrow. The thrall dodged, and the arrow only grazed its shoulder, leaving a thin line of sizzling flesh. It hissed, reeling back, but the family took their chance and disappeared behind burning houses. Alaris' relief vanished instantly. The thrall turned toward her, crimson eyes glowing in the firelight. It yanked out the arrow from its back and flung it aside, black blood dripping from the wound. Then it charged at her, moving almost too fast to see, claws outstretched. Her breath caught. She dropped low, seeking cover. The thrall leapt after her, moving with the speed of a striking snake. It crashed into the debris, scattering splinters as it clawed through wood. She scrambled away, choking on smoke. She circled the wreckage, but the thrall vaulted onto a cart, poised like a predator. Its eyes locked with hers, not just red but swirling with dark veins, as if blood vessels had burst and reformed beneath its irises. When it opened its mouth, she saw rows of needle-like teeth behind the prominent fangs. It let out a sound she'd never heard before, half hiss, half laugh, vibrating at a frequency that made her skin crawl. Before it could pounce, Alaris jabbed an arrow upward, the silver tip catching the thrall's throat. Its body crashed partly onto her, but she wedged her knee against its torso and shoved. Black blood splattered her tunic, the stench making her gag. The thrall rolled off, gurgling. She forced herself up, ignoring the pain in her hip where it had struck her. The vampire tried to rise, but the arrow in its throat kept it down. She heard bones crack, saw hatred blaze in its eyes. After a final spasm, it lay still. Alaris staggered back, vision graying at the edges. She steadied herself against a wall, glancing at the carnage around her. She'd killed a vampire thrall in direct combat, but how many more waited in the shadows? A distant scream cut through her thoughts, a voice she recognized, high, frantic, filled with heartbreak. Tanel, her young cousin, only 40 by elven count, barely an adolescent, always bright-eyed and curious. Alaris' chest tightened. She's alive. Tanel, she shouted, forgetting stealth. She ran toward her cousin's voice, dodging bodies and burning debris. Flames cracked above, and a nearby roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Heat seared her skin, but she pushed forward, half blind from ash. She followed the street until it opened onto a narrow lane between the weaver's cottage and storage sheds. This area was partly burned but not yet consumed. Dark shapes moved in the smoke. She heard Tennelle again, sobbing, begging for help. "Hold on," Ilaris cried, tears stinging from the acrid smoke. She slipped on blood, her boots sliding on wet cobblestones. Through the gloom, she saw Tennelle crouched beside a body. The elf on the ground didn't move, likely Tennelle's mother or father. Ilaris' heart contracted, but she couldn't stop. Tennelle screamed as a tall vampire in dark leathers approached. This one moved differently, with precision rather than feral aggression. Its pale skin was stretched too tight across its bones, giving it a skeletal appearance. Two more thralls hovered behind, silhouettes in the firelight. They watched with curiosity, exchanging words in a guttural language that sounded like rocks grinding against metal. "No," Ilaris roared. She dashed forward, arrow ready. She fired before the thrall could turn. The silver tip sank into its side. It snarled in pain, stumbling, but didn't fall. Tennelle looked up and saw Ilaris. She tried crawling toward her, but her left leg was twisted, her skirt soaked with blood. Ilaris gritted her teeth, readying another arrow. The thrall whipped around, eyes narrowing as it recognized her. One of its companions lunged from the side, forcing Ilaris to leap back. She fired in panic, her arrow vanishing harmlessly into smoke. The thrall was on her in a heartbeat, slashing at her middle. She twisted away, but claws tore through her leather jerkin, scraping her ribs. Pain flared. She kicked out for space. The thrall snarled, mouth partly open, showing elongated fangs stained with fresh blood. Ilaris tumbled into the dusty street, scrambling for her dropped bow. Another thrall joined the attack, cackling with an eerily human voice. She was outnumbered. Ash blurred her vision. "You'll die if you stay," a cold voice warned in her mind. But Tennelle, a blow struck her shoulder. The second thrall pinned her against a collapsed fence. Her bow clattered away. She reached for her dagger, but the vampire was too quick, a clawed hand closing around her throat. The stench of death and rot filled her nose as it leaned in, hissing with triumph. Desperate, Ilaris smashed her forearm into its face, briefly loosening its grip. She yanked her silver-edged dagger from her belt and drove it upward. The blade sank into the thrall's chest. It shrieked, half scream, half roar. Hot, tainted blood sprayed her hand. She rolled aside as the thrall clutched its chest, staggering. She rose, heart pounding, searching for Tennelle. Her cousin still lay on the ground beside the motionless adult. The first thrall, the one shed shot in the side, limped toward Tennelle. "Stop!" Ilaris snarled. She charged, ignoring the pain in her ribs, and tackled the thrall from behind. They crashed onto the cobblestones. She stabbed downward repeatedly, silver flashing in firelight. After the third strike, the thrall gasped and went limp. Breathing hard, Ilaris turned to Tennelle. The girl's face was ashen, green eyes wide and wet with tears. Blood pulsed from a wound on her thigh, and her left arm hung limp, possibly broken. "Tennelle," Ilaris crouched beside her, ignoring the cinders burning her hair. "Can you hear me?" The girl's breath was shallow, her words barely audible. Ilaris, you came back." Ilaris smoothed Tennelle's hair, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's going to be all right." The lie tasted bitter. She glanced at the elf Tennelle had been holding. It was her Aunt Oline, Tennelle's mother, her throat torn open, eyes staring lifelessly at the sky. Grief twisted inside Ilaris, but she had no time to mourn. More thralls were out there. "Can you stand?" she asked, checking Tennelle's injuries. The leg wound was serious, blood soaked through the torn skirt. The bone might be fractured. Tennelle's tears cut tracks through the soot on her face. I don't think so. My parents." "I'm sorry." Ilaris squeezed her shoulder. "But we have to move." A burst of sparks made her flinch as the weaver's cottage collapsed, flames billowing into the lane. She heard more inhuman shrieks and growls. Vampires were closing in. "He'll carry you," she muttered, bracing herself. She slid an arm under Tanel's good shoulder and tried lifting her. Tanel screamed in pain, nearly breaking Eloris' grip. Hot blood soaked through her fingers. Tanel trembled violently, her face chalk white. "My leg," she sobbed. "It hurts." Ilaris bit her lip, tears welling. Tanel was losing too much blood. With a surge of adrenaline, Ilaris hoisted her up, putting the girl's arm around her shoulders. Tanel moaned, leaning heavily against her. Where to go? The gate was behind them, but probably crawling with thralls. Half the village burned, leaving only the narrow side streets. She thought of the clearing where Ferren waited. If she could get Tanel there, maybe they could escape deeper into the forest. A hiss behind her made her turn. Another thrall, the one Shed stabbed in the chest, lurched from shadows, its face twisted with fury, black blood still dripping from the wound. Though mortally injured, it wasn't dead yet, driven by pure hatred. Ilaris had no time to fight while carrying Tanel. She stumbled forward, half dragging her cousin. Her lungs burned, the cut on her ribs throbbed. The thrall hissed again, then lunged. She heard claws scraping cobblestones behind them. She looked left and spotted the weaver's shed door, partly collapsed, but maybe passable. She pushed through the debris, ignoring the burning rafters overhead. Tanel whimpered. Sparks rained down, scorching Eloris' scalp. Her eyes streamed just a little further. The thrall forced its way in, screeching with rage. Ilaris saw a heavy wooden beam fallen from the roof, gathering her remaining strength. She heaved it one-handed across the thrall's path. The creature stumbled, momentarily trapped. "Go, Tanel, go," she urged, though her cousin could barely move. Step by agonizing step, they reached the back of the shed. One wall was completely ablaze, but a small window offered escape. Desperate, Ilaris kicked at the boards around the window, widening the gap. The thrall howled, throwing off the beam. Heat intensified around them. If the shed collapsed now, they'd be trapped. "Up you go," she gasped, lifting Tanel toward the window. Despite her pain, the girl managed to squeeze through. Ilaris followed, hissing as a burning timber grazed her leg. They tumbled into an alley behind the shed, cold air shocking after the inferno. No time to rest. The thrall was forcing its way through flames to reach them. Ilaris scanned the alley, one end blocked by debris, the other leading to a side street that might offer escape. "Come on," she urged, supporting Tanel's waist. They staggered down the alley, the thrall crawling through the window behind them, shrieking as flames burned its flesh. Still it pursued, single-minded in its hatred. Ilaris' limbs felt leaden. Each fight, the smoke, her injuries, all drained her strength. Tanel's weight made every step a struggle. The thrall was gaining. With horror, she realized they couldn't outrun it. They reached the side street and Ilaris glimpsed hope, the southern edge of Whisperglade, where forest darkness might hide them. If she could just reach the trees. "Hold on," she gasped, dragging Tanel forward. The thrall's ragged breathing drew closer. A wave of dizziness hit her, but she pushed through. They passed the last burning buildings. No other vampires in sight. The thrall behind them growled. She turned just as it leapt for Tanel. "No," Ilaris twisted, raising her dagger. The impact sent all three crashing to the ground. Tanel cried out in fresh pain. The thrall's claws missed her by inches. They landed hard. Ilaris pinned beneath the thrall's weight. Its face hovered inches from hers, lips pulled back in a snarl. She stabbed upward, but it knocked her arm aside. Her vision sparked with pain. Tanel tried pushing the vampire, but she was too weak. The thrall turned its feral gaze on her. Ilaris summoned her last strength and wedged her knee into its stomach, creating just enough space to free her other hand. She grabbed a short arrow from her quiver and jammed the silver tip into the vampire's neck. It reared back, gargling a scream. Black ether gushed from the wound. Ilaris kicked it off and lunged forward, plunging her dagger into its chest. She twisted until the body went limp. Gasping, she collapsed sideways, lungs burning. The world spun, but Tanel's pained moans pulled her back to reality. She crawled to her cousin, who lay bleeding on the cobblestones. "Stay with me," she begged, pressing her hand against Tanel's wound. The girl's eyes rolled back, tears cutting through soot on her cheeks. It hurts so much. Tanel whimpered. I can't feel my foot. Panic flooded Ellery's chest. The wound was terrible. Tanel was losing blood too fast. Even if they escaped, she had no way to treat such an injury. Behind them, Whisperglade burned, vampires prowling through flames. There was no safe haven, no healer to find. Still, she refused to give up. She tore a strip from her sleeve, trying to make a tourniquet around Tanel's thigh. The girl's scream cut through her heart. I know, Elaris said, her own tears falling. I'm sorry. Just hold on. She heard vampires calling to each other from the burning streets. The raid wasn't over. If she stayed, they'd soon be discovered. Despite the danger, she tried lifting Tanel again, but the girl's body hung limp, consciousness fading, blood soaked through the makeshift bandage. Come on, Elaris muttered, straining. She hefted Tanel onto her shoulders. The girl weighed less than an adult, but still felt like stone. She managed one step, then another, the tree line tantalizingly close. Suddenly, Tanel coughed blood, spattering Elaris' tunic. Her body convulsed. The tourniquet was already soaked through. Stay with me, Elaris pleaded. Each step sent pain through her ribs, but she kept moving, 50 yards to the trees. Then Tanel's body spasmed. Her voice rose in feverish muttering. Theme mother, father, Elaris? The girl's eyes fluttered, a gurgle escaping her throat. Elaris felt her muscles go completely limp. She had to stop. Tanel might die in seconds, but stopping meant the vampires would find them. Despair crashed over her. She carefully lowered Tanel to the ground. The girl's breathing was ragged, gaze unfocused. Elaris tried tightening the tourniquet, but blood kept flowing. Tanel's skin had turned ashen. Please, Tanel, she whispered, pressing her forehead to her cousin's. Stay with me. I'll get you out. Don't give up. A tear slid from Tanel's eye, though she made no sound. Elaris heard hisses in the distance, footsteps approaching. She had to move now, or they'd both die. She tried lifting Tanel again, but realized with horror that her cousin was too far gone. Even if they reached safety, Tanel needed immediate skilled care. The village herbalist was dead, everything in flames. There was no escape route fast enough. Tanel's eyes fixed on Elaris, suddenly clear amid her delirium. Her lips parted. She whispered, Go, run. Elaris' throat tightened. I won't leave you, she said, tears flowing freely. Tanel gave a tiny head shake, her own eyes glistening. You can save me. They'll kill you too. No. Elaris choked, but one look at Tanel's leg told the truth. The wound was fatal. Even if Tanel lived a few more minutes, the vampires would find them. She's right. Time stretched painfully. Footsteps drew nearer. Tanel's breathing grew shallow, pupils dilating. She looked at Elaris with heartbreaking fear and acceptance. Forgive me, she whispered. I'm sorry. Elaris fought back sobs. She kissed Tanel's forehead. No, Tanel. I'm the one who's sorry. I wish I could save you. Tanel shuddered, pain making her fingers curl. Elaris held her hand, feeling its chill. I'll find who did this, she promised. I'll make them pay. Tanel's lips moved silently. Then her eyes closed. Elaris felt her final breath leave. Silence fell, broken only by distant flames. Elaris pressed her hand to Tanel's chest, hoping for a heartbeat. Nothing. Her cousin's face had relaxed, all tension gone. Tears burned. Elaris' eyes as a broken sob escaped her. From the village came a guttural cry, a thrall calling to others. If she didn't leave now, she'd be trapped. Rage, grief, and helplessness churned inside her. She wanted to carry Tanel away, try once more, but she couldn't fight reality. Tanel was gone. With shaking hands, she closed her cousin's eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Ash drifted between them, carrying the scent of burning wood and flesh. She rose on trembling legs, heart heavy with despair. One last look at Tanel's still form, then she turned away. If she stayed, Tanel's final words, her final sacrifice would be meaningless. Shoulders hunched, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face, Elaris slipped into the trees. Behind her, Whisperglade burned, the screams of victims mixing with triumphant vampire howls. The onslaught had consumed everything, and she was powerless to stop it. She moved on instinct, driven by the raw need to survive. Branches scratched her face and arms, but the forest's darkness shielded her from vampire eyes. Undergrowth caught at her boots, as if trying to drag her back. She pushed on, her mind filled with images: Tanel's lifeless body, her father's torn corpse, her mother and sister missing. An unbearable sense of failure hollowed her soul. I couldn't save them, she thought. I couldn't even save Tanel. When she recognized the cedar trees where Shed left Ferrin, she paused, gathering herself to speak. She heard him first, ragged breathing, a whispered prayer she didn't understand. "Ferrin," she called softly. He gasped. "Ilaris." He emerged from behind the cedar, relief in his eyes quickly turning to horror. As he saw her condition, covered in blood and ash, tears cutting tracks through soot. "Gods," he whispered, approaching. "You're hurt." She touched the claw marks on her ribs. "I'll live," her voice barely held. "The vampires, the villages," words failed her. Ferrin helped her sit against the trunk. "I heard screams, then saw the fires grow. I was afraid to follow." Guilt lined his face. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "You'd have died. They're everywhere." He gently examined her wounds, exposing the shallow gashes across her ribcage. They stung at his touch, but weren't deep enough to be fatal. She winced. "I have salve in my pack," he said, reaching for the small bag at his side. "Not much, but it'll clean the cuts." As he tended her injuries, Ilaris leaned back, closing her eyes. She tried to steady her breathing, but images of Tanel's final moments surged, stoking a hollow ache inside her. She died alone, with nothing but my useless promises. "They're killing everyone," she murmured, voice numb, burning everything, dragging bodies away. Ferrin's hands trembled as he applied the salve, but he continued working. "I heard rumors vampires were attacking other villages too. My hometown in the lowlands was said to be under siege. That's why I came north, to see if elves had defenses." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Defenses? We never expected a full-scale attack." Whisperglade was peaceful. Her voice broke on the last word, remembering how that peace had vanished in a single night. He finished bandaging her, his touch gentle, despite his own injuries. "That's all I can do now." She nodded gratefully, gazing through the trees toward the burning village. Orange flames still glowed against the sky. "My home is gone. Everything is gone." "Did you find survivors?" Ferrin asked quietly. Fresh tears threatened. "A few," she managed, voice cracking. "But I couldn't save them." He squeezed her shoulder awkwardly. "I'm sorry." She stared at the burning horizon, hatred and grief warring inside her. They sat in silence, listening to distant roars and crackling flames. Eventually the night grew eerily quiet. Ilaris remained alert despite her exhaustion. Her limbs shook, her wounds throbbed. Ferrin dozed fitfully beside her, pale from blood loss. Finally, the glow over Whisperglade began to fade, replaced by columns of smoke. She imagined the vampires withdrawing, leaving only ashes and bodies. The nightmare had begun. Xeris forced herself to stand, wincing at the pain in her ribs. She picked up her bow. "We can stay here," she said, voice hoarse. "They might search the forest at dawn." "Where will we go?" Ferrin asked. She hesitated, trying to think clearly through her grief. "There's nowhere truly safe," a voice whispered, but she pushed back. "East, toward the old watchtower. It's abandoned but might offer shelter." Ferrin frowned, looking toward the ruined village. "Shouldn't we look for more survivors?" Ilaris closed her eyes briefly, remembering Tanel's agony and the vampires swarming every street. "If anyone escaped, they fled deeper into the woods by now. Going back is suicide." He nodded reluctantly. "Lead the way." They began their difficult trek through darkness. The forest was treacherous at night, the ground uneven. Ilaris relied on her hunter's instincts, watching for signs of pursuit. They moved in tense silence, each step taking them further from the only homestead known. Her father's face haunted her, then Tanel's final words. With every painful breath, the memories assailed her, but she pressed on, forcing herself to focus on survival. Keep moving, or die. Farron struggled behind her, his shoulder wound limiting his movement. Several times he stumbled on fallen branches, and Alaris had to steady him, ignoring her own pain. They were a sorry sight, two wounded refugees with no destination. After nearly an hour, they stopped by a moss-covered boulder. To the east, the forest grew denser, its canopy almost blocking the moon. If they continued, they might reach the old watchtower by dawn. "Rest," Alaris said, her voice raw. She sank onto a fallen log, hand pressed to her bandaged side. Her body ached, as if beaten. Farron leaned against the boulder, teeth clenched in pain. For several minutes, they just breathed together, listening for danger. The forest's night sounds, owls, insects, rustling leaves, seemed ordinary, but each unexpected noise set Alaris on edge. "Why are they doing this?" Farron finally asked. She thought of old tales Shed never fully believed. "Blood," she said simply. "Some say they follow an ancient vampire lord who can coordinate attacks across vast regions. If that's true, maybe they're expanding their territory." Her voice caught. "Or maybe it's just killing for killing's sake. My grandmother said vampires were just legends," Farron murmured, shaking his head. "I wish Shed been right." Alaris looked up at the scattered stars peeking through branches. Her mother and sister might still be out there, captured or fleeing. With each passing hour, the chances of finding them shrank. "I can't think about that now," she told herself, though it was nearly impossible to push the fear away. Rising, she helped Farron stand. "We should keep moving. Another hour, and we'll reach the watchtower. We can hide until morning." "You think sunlight stops them?" he asked, hope in his voice. She shrugged. "They're weaker by day, they say. At least they don't roam as freely." She didn't add that it might not be enough to save them. Together, they continued east, each step a painful reminder of all they'd lost. Behind them, the glow of Whisperglade's destruction faded into darkness. In her mind, Alaris carried the dead, her father, Tanel, neighbors Shed known her entire life. Their faces drove her forward, promising a reckoning she couldn't yet imagine. The vampires had shown their claws, and she would remember every drop of spilled blood. As they walked, she sent a silent prayer to any god still watching. "Forgive me for those I couldn't save. Help me protect whoever remains." The path ahead looked grim, but she wouldn't falter. She couldn't save everyone, but perhaps, if she kept fighting, she might save someone, and in doing so defy the darkness that had swallowed her world. As they moved deeper into the forest, Alaris felt a prickling sensation at the base of her skull. She turned, scanning the shadows behind them. Nothing visible, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A twig snapped in the distance, too deliberate for an animal. Then came a sound that froze her blood. A low whistling call, answered by another from a different direction. The sound carried a strange melody, almost musical, but with no human warmth. "What was that?" Farron whispered, eyes wide. Alaris reached for her bow. "Are they tracking us?" she murmured. "Keep moving." The whistles came again, closer this time. They weren't running fast enough. Twilight descends. Alaris paused at the forest's edge, scanning the tree line. She caught the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, something rotten and sweet. It was nearly dusk when the sky shifted from pale gold to bruised purple. Any other day she might have enjoyed this moment. Not tonight, not with every nerve on edge. She exhaled softly and stepped past the shadowy oaks and elms. A cold breeze bit her cheeks, but she ignored it. As an elf of the Whisperglade clan, her senses were sharper than any human's. She could read the forest floor like a book, spot broken twigs in odd patterns, or moss crushed by footsteps heavier than a deer's. That skill had saved her life many times in her 18 decades. But now, her heart pounded in a way she couldn't control. She had been hunting since dawn, her quiver full of fresh arrows. She had spent half of them trying to take down a stubborn boar that kept slipping away. When it finally vanished for good, she decided to head back to the village. Her bones ached with weariness, and thoughts of a warm hearth and hot meal pulled her forward. But as she neared the outskirts, an eerie silence replaced the usual evening sounds. No smoke rose from cookfires. No voices drifted through the twilight. The village might have gone to sleep early, except the quiet felt wrong, like a held breath before a scream. Alert and tense, she moved carefully. A fallen oak became her lookout spot. She crouched, peered ahead. In the fading light, she could make out the stone arches of Whisperglade's entrance. Normally, lanterns would guide travelers in. Tonight, unlit torches hung from hooks. One lay broken on the ground. Beneath the gate, dark stains marked the cobblestones. Dread crept into her mind. Blood. She couldn't be sure from here, but the thought made her pulse race. Lips tight, Ilaris notched an arrow. She stepped away from the oak and moved forward. The dirt path turned to cobblestones at the village edge. Her boots, usually silent, seemed too loud in the quiet. She slowed her breathing, watching for any movement. The sky darkened quickly. The half-moon rose, casting pale light over the treetops. The silence pressed on her ears until she wanted to scream just to break it. She stopped at the gate. Yes, it was blood, splattered along the stone like something had been dragged. She touched the wooden gate and found 4 gashes in the timber, as if huge claws had cut across it. Splinters stuck out at odd angles, and the wood felt damp. "Goddess help us," she whispered, her voice shaking. Ilaris' mind raced. A bear. No bear would drag prey into a village or leave such evenly spaced claw marks. A warg or forest beast. Maybe. Her father had told her stories of monsters, but none quite matched this. These claw marks looked different. A chill ran up her spine. Shed heard the older elves whisper about strange happenings in distant places. People vanishing, half-eaten livestock, talk of dark magic. Shed never really believed it, or maybe Shed just hoped never to see it herself. Taking shallow breaths, she moved forward. Past the gate, the main street was empty. Thatched roofs stood dark against the purple sky, without a single window lit. Doors hung open. She could just make out an overturned wagon outside the baker's shop. Bread baskets spilled across the ground, scattered like someone had fled in panic. One loaf lay torn, its crust dark with something that wasn't flour. The stench of decay grew stronger, blood and rot. Ilaris fought down her nausea. Her eyes moved from doorway to doorway, expecting someone to stumble out wounded. Looking for help, no one came. She kept moving, sticking to shadows, arrow ready. Her ears twitched at every sound, every shift of the wind. The silence was crushing. Where is everyone? She wondered. Her village had at least 200 elves, not counting travelers. They couldn't just vanish. Even if they'd run from an attack, there would be footprints, dropped belongings, signs of struggle. Instead, it felt like the place had been swallowed whole. She took a few more steps and nearly slipped on something. Looking down, she saw a dark streak of blood leading into an alley. Her stomach tightened. Focus, she told herself. Keep it together. She took a shaky breath and squared her shoulders. The next stretch of road was worse. A shawl fluttered from a fallen crate. A child's wooden toy lay broken in the dirt, and near a stone trough she saw the first body. He lay face down, pinned under an overturned barrel. His hair, once silver like most elves, was matted with blood. His clothes were torn. She recognized him. Avery, who worked for the Cooper. Her vision blurred as she tried to process what she was seeing. Every part of her wanted to rush to him, turn him over, check if he somehow still lived. But from the unnatural stillness of his limbs, she knew he was gone. What did this? She wondered, but feared the answer was worse than any beast she knew. A traveling merchant had muttered something just days ago about fanged devils prowling after dark. Shed dismissed his words as drunk talk. Now, that memory returned with sickening clarity. She pulled her gaze from Avera's body and forced herself onward. Each house she passed stood open and dark. In one yard, she saw the half-eaten remains of what might have been a dog, its fur matted and torn. Flies buzzed. Her stomach turned. She gripped her bow like it was keeping her alive, the arrow trembling slightly. A short way ahead, the village center opened into a wide square paved with worn stones. An ornate fountain stood in the middle, a carved Lorelin, the elven goddess of harmony, where children usually played and neighbors gathered for water. Now the basin was cracked, and the trickling water had a dark tint. Overturned buckets lay scattered. A wheelbarrow rested on its side, vegetables crushed underfoot, and across the ground, long smears of blood leading east. It looked like bodies had been dragged away. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She felt trapped by the weight of violence hanging over her home. Ilaris scanned the edges of the square. Still no survivors. No movement, except for shadows flickering at the corner of her vision. She dreaded the night closing in, the sky growing darker with each wasted moment. Something brushed her ankle. She spun. Arrow aimed, heart racing. A battered cat, with patches of fur missing, slunk from the shadows. Its eyes reflected the faint moonlight. It hissed at her before darting into a dark alley. Ilaris lowered her bow, feeling sweat on her brow despite the cold. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Someone must be alive." She reached the east side of the square, following the blood trail. An entire patch of ground looked raked by massive claws, deep furrows in the dirt, splintered wood from broken crates. She saw more footprints, some overlapping, a few too large and heavy to be from her people. "This is where they caught us," she realized, dread choking her. Whatever they were, they'd herded the villagers this way. Half slipping on the bloody stones, she pressed on until she reached a broad wooden door in a tall, moss-covered building. The door was shredded, as if hit with inhuman strength. She pushed it open and looked inside. It was the village storehouse, once filled with grain sacks and dried fruits. Pale moonlight from the doorway fell on a pair of motionless legs. Her throat went dry. She moved closer, stepping around spilled grain dusting the floor. At the back of the storeroom, 3 bodies lay tangled together, all elves. Their throats were torn open, their faces frozen in terror. Blood soaked their clothes and pooled beneath them. Ilaris' breath caught. She recognized one of them, Mistress Rytha, the kind archivist who ran the village library. Rytha's gentle eyes were now fixed wide, lips parted in a silent plea. Ilaris gagged, a hand over her mouth. She'd seen death before, on hunts, or when sickness took an elder, but never this kind of vicious destruction. Her body shook. She wanted to scream, to run, to lash out. But no tears came, just a numb shock, and the horrible question, am I too late to save anyone? Backing away, she almost tripped over a broken shelf. When her shoulders hit the doorframe, she made herself turn and leave. Her stomach heaved, but she swallowed hard, survival instincts taking over. She had to keep looking. She had to find someone, anyone still alive. Back in the street, she looked up at the roofs. The moonlight showed more carnage, broken windows, blood splattered everywhere, and handprints in blood along a fence. This isn't a random animal attack, she thought. This is deliberate. Her mind went to half-remembered stories of vampires, pale night creatures who craved blood. She wanted to dismiss it as just a story. Vampires were tales to scare children into obeying curfew. But if they were real, she remembered the merchant's frightened words about fanged devils. A snippet of legend surfaced. Vampires left drained corpses, often with savage claw marks or battered flesh. The scenes around her matched those stories too well. Her stomach churned. Her thoughts turned to her parents, to her little sister. She had left them at dawn, expecting to be back by sunset. Where are they now? Fear gnawed at her. Without thinking, she ran down the street, ignoring the gore and danger. She had to check her family's home. The path blurred at the edges of her vision. Houses loomed like silent watchers, windows like dark eyes following her desperation. As she neared a corner, she sensed movement. She dove behind a stone well, heart pounding. Bow raised, she peered around the edge. She saw 2 silhouettes. Her heart soared briefly. Then the shapes moved into moonlight, revealing gaunt figures with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed red. One crouched over a pinned elf. Even from 30 paces away, Ilaris heard soft sucking sounds, followed by a wet tear. Her stomach twisted. Creatures of legend, no denying it now. The thing feeding had razor-sharp nails gleaming with blood. Its companion paced, head cocked oddly, sniffing the air. Ilaris pressed a hand over her mouth. She wanted to scream, to charge, to do anything but hide. The feeding creature suddenly hissed and reared up, letting the limp elf's corpse drop. Blood dripped from its chin. It sniffed the air alongside its companion and snarled. They sensed her. Ilaris ducked behind the well. Time slowed. Their footsteps scraped closer on the stones. They smell me. She lifted her bow, steadied her breath, and nocked an arrow with trembling fingers. She was deadly with a bow, but could an arrow stop these things? A step, another step. They were close. She imagined a pale face peering around the well, eyes burning with hunger. She glanced at her silver arrowhead gleaming in the faint light. Legend said vampires feared silver. If that was true, the arrow might wound them, but she was outnumbered. If she fired, the other would attack. Moments passed in tense silence. Their footsteps stopped. She heard them hiss to each other in guttural, inhuman sounds. Then, with a soft rush of air, they moved away. Alaris risked a look around the edge. They were gone. For several heartbeats, she stayed crouched, not believing her luck. They must have noticed something else. Maybe that cat, or decided they'd fed enough. Carefully, she stood, arms and legs shaking. On the cobblestones lay the dead elf, face frozen in agony. Alaris bit back a sob. I have to keep going. I have to find my family. She hurried away, slipping into the shadows. Once past the last turn, she found herself on the lane to her parents' home. The old willow in their yard drooped in the cold breeze. Their door stood ajar. Light flickered across the threshold. Maybe her family had barricaded themselves inside. She crept onto the porch. Her hand shook as she reached for the door. It swung inward, with barely a creak. The living area was a mess. Table overturned, broken plates on the floor. A lamp flickered on the mantel, casting dancing shadows. Her mother's loom lay toppled in the corner. Threads pulled into wild tangles. Alaris' chest tightened. Mother? Father? She called softly, her voice cracking. Oranis? Her sister's name felt strange in this awful quiet. She stepped around ceramic shards. No answer came. Just the lamp's soft sputter. A rust-colored streak ran along the floor, leading deeper inside. She swallowed the lump in her throat and followed it. It led to her father's woodworking room. A single table stood in the center, tools arranged neatly on the walls. But now the table was broken in half. Its frame splintered. A bent chisel lay in a pool of congealing blood. On the far side was the reason her father lay on his back, chest torn open. His face, though pale and twisted, was unmistakably his. Alaris' vision blurred with tears. Father, the word escaped as a raw whisper. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees. Her trembling hands hovered over his wounds. He was cold, eyes half closed in death. Tears came freely now, running down her cheeks. I wasn't here to protect you, her mind screamed. She pushed the guilt down. She had to see if her mother or sister had somehow survived. She forced herself up and staggered to the hallway. No trace of her mother in the bedroom, just a knocked-over lamp and the smell of blood. Aranis' small cot was empty too. No sign of them. Alaris clung to hope. Maybe they escaped. Maybe they ran into the forest. But the amount of blood on the floor told a different story. She returned to the main room, wiping tears from her eyes. Too many gone, she thought, mind spinning with horror. A choking helplessness threatened to overwhelm her. She had hunted dangerous beasts, but never faced terror like this. The stories of vampires hadn't prepared her for the devastation they could bring in just hours. The lamp flickered, the flame shrinking to a weak glow. Darkness pressed in. She could almost hear her father teaching her woodcraft, or her mother singing in the evenings. She bit her lip until it bled, tasting copper with her grief. Hold on, Alaris. Don't break now. If she froze here crying, she'd be easy prey for any vampire still lurking around. Gently, she covered her father's face with a cloth from a nearby basket. It was all the dignity she could offer him. Then she backed away, accepting there was nothing more she could do for him now. Find survivors. Find help. The thought pushed her forward, yet a deeper question burned. Why? Why here? Her village was small, hidden in the forest. No wealth to tempt raiders, random attack, or calculated slaughter. Stepping onto the porch, she looked at the darkening sky. The moon had risen higher, bathing the village in pale light. Below it, the carnage looked even more haunting, like a grotesque painting come to life. Her eyes drifted to the slender spires beyond the eastern horizon, the old watchtowers that once belonged to the elven high guard centuries ago. They stood dark against the night, silent and useless in this new horror. Fresh tears burned her eyes. A faint moan reached her ears. She froze. It came from near the willow tree. Hope stirred in her chest. She descended the steps cautiously, bow ready. The moan came again, a pained sound. She circled the willow trunk, parted the hanging branches, and found a figure slumped against the bark. He was an older elf in a blood-stained tunic. Kelphis, one of her father's carpenter friends. His breath came in ragged gasps, sides slick with dark blood. Deep gashes marked his chest and arms. He wouldn't last long. His eyes flared with panic when he saw her. Eolaris. Blood dribbled from his mouth. They shadows. She crouched beside him, pressed her hand against his wound. Blood seeped between her fingers. "Hold on," she urged, voice breaking. He coughed red. "No, time. They're here. Run." Elaris' vision blurred. "Kelphis. My mother? Aranis? Did you?" Pain twisted his face. "Southgate saw them run. Your sister," another bloody cough. "They took some, dragged them, drank." His voice weakened, laughed, like a game. Despair filled his eyes. "Warn others." His voice trailed off, eyes dimming. For a moment, she stayed still, forcing herself to breathe. She closed Kelphis' eyes, tears tracking fresh lines down her cheeks. Then she rose unsteadily. Her mother and sister might still be alive. Hope replaced her numb shock. The south gate wasn't far. Maybe they'd escaped before the vampires overwhelmed everyone. She turned south, forcing her body into a run despite her exhaustion. Every few steps, she paused to scan for more of those gaunt shapes. The night had grown fully dark, broken only by moonlight and occasional torches lying unlit on the ground. Passing the blacksmith's shop, she glanced inside. No bodies, but everything was ransacked. Forge embers long cold. The smell of gore lingered. She kept moving. When she reached the south gate, her chest heaved with exertion and dread. The gate hung battered, hinged on just one side, the other twisted at an odd angle. Blood stained the stone arch, and drag marks led away from the village into the thick forest. An overturned cart lay in splinters. She circled the wreckage, searching for any sign of her mother or sister. Then she spotted it, caught in the wooden debris, a small green ribbon, Aranis' hair ribbon. She picked it up, eyes welling again. With trembling fingers, she tied the ribbon around her wrist. They came this way. Fresh footprints and broken branches at the forest's edge suggested a group. Either villagers or their captors had gone through. At least it meant Aranis might be alive. Unless Elaris pushed away the horrifying thought of her sister in vampire hands. The possibility filled her with both dread and determination. If there was any chance to rescue them, she had to follow. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth made her spin. Arrow ready. A deer? Another cat? Or a vampire? Her heart pounded painfully. She searched the darkness. The rustling stopped. She caught a whiff of something metallic blood. Quietly, she moved toward the sound. Footsteps light as whispers. Her elven eyes adjusted to the dim light, making out shapes among the trees. She stopped mid-step at what she saw. A small clearing just beyond the gate, where several corpses lay piled. The thrall's head whipped up, eyes blazing red when her twigs snapped. Elaris didn't hesitate. Silver-tipped arrow flew true, striking its chest. It shrieked, staggering. Smoke hissed where silver met flesh. "It works." She knocked another arrow. The thrall tried to pull out the arrow, hissing in pain. Dark fluid oozed from the wound, steaming in the cool night air. It bared its fangs. Elaris fired again. This one lodged in its throat. Its shriek became a choked gurgle. The vampire clawed at the arrows, but soon collapsed onto the pile of dead villagers. Silence returned to the clearing. For a long moment, Elaris stood frozen, heart hammering. She had never killed anything so human-like. Even in death, the thrall's face showed hungry malice. She forced down the bile, rising in her throat. As she scanned the rest of the clearing, her knees nearly buckled among the scattered bodies. She recognized neighbors, rarely on the tanner. Harani, the baker's wife. None moved, and none was her mother or sister. Relief and horror warred within her. The bodies were barely recognizable, the ground soaked with blood. She took a step back, hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. She couldn't linger. More vampires could be nearby. She needed to keep searching beyond the village. But with night fully upon her, tracking would be nearly impossible. She was torn between desperation to follow her family's trail and knowing she lacked the strength or the plan to do it safely. If there were more creatures in the forest, she could easily become prey. It was a cruel choice. Risk everything now, or retreat and return better prepared. Her body screamed to run into the woods, but survival held her frozen. She stared at the broken gate and the scattered bodies. Is anyone even left to save? Grief threatened to crush her, yet staying here was suicide. If vampires were prowling nearby, she'd be surrounded in minutes. She put her bow across her back, counted her remaining arrows, and scanned the area once more. Time to move. Ilaris forced steady breaths. Just the branches, she told herself, yet the fear felt justified. She listened, tense. No further sounds came. Finally, she lowered her bow, though her mind stayed alert. They're out there. As moonlight filtered through the branches, Ilaris knew the terror she'd witnessed was just the beginning. The vampires had shown their claws, their bloodthirst, and the damage they could do in a single night. The forests and villages beyond her home were likely facing the same threat. A tear slid down her cheek, but she gripped her bow tighter. She wouldn't give up. Come dawn, she'd keep searching. Maybe she'd find a clue, or someone else who made it out alive. And when she got any chance to fight back, she'd take it. The thought kept her going. She spotted something near the ruined gate. A cottage door hung open, with blood smeared on the threshold. Claw marks deeper than any she'd seen before glinted on the wooden planks. Strange runes like they'd been carved on purpose. A chill ran up her spine. They want us to know they're here, she realized. They're not just feeding, they're showing off. The wind moaned, or maybe it was another victim. Ilaris wiped her tears. Everything she knew was gone. Clutching Aranis ribbon on her wrist, she pushed back the wave of pain. If her sister was captured, or her mother, she wouldn't abandon them. A door somewhere banged in the wind. She lifted her chin. Or stop them. The thought was crazy, but it kept her standing. Behind her, Theron stirred with a pained breath. His wounds needed better care than she could give right now. She'd stay with him tonight, under this cedar, and do what she could. The screams had quieted, with just the crackle of fires and occasional inhuman calls in the distance. Well, make it through this, she whispered, though he probably couldn't hear. She counted her remaining arrows. Only a few left, most silver-tipped. Not enough for a vampire army, but enough to keep them alive if she was careful. She'd need to find materials soon and make more. Keeping her bow close, Ilaris leaned against the cedar, eyes fixed on the forest edge. She wouldn't sleep deeply. Any sound, any shadow, and she'd be ready. She tightened her grip on the bow. In the distance, something howled. Too human for a wolf, too monstrous for an elf. The night wasn't done with her yet. Bitten, Molly impatiently checked her phone in between looking around for Jeremy. He had messaged her to meet at this address, but he was 15 minutes late. Cars passed by with confused drivers staring at the curvy blonde in her tight-fitting red dress. She was quite a contrast to the rusted junkyard behind her. Getting increasingly annoyed, she sent a message to Jeremy. "Where are you?" Right as the message went through, she could see him pedaling up the street on his bike. He was wearing tattered jeans and a t-shirt with his long brown hair tied back into a bun. Molly looked at him with an icy glare. "You're late." "Relax, I had to double-check I packed everything," Jeremy said, holding up his camera bag. "Well, I'm not paying you to be late." Jeremy turned away, rolling his eyes as he locked his bike up against the junkyard's chain-link fence. Molly had offered half his usual day rate. Jeremy had only agreed to take the job as a favor to Molly's roommate so she could get some peace for the day. "What are we doing at the gross junkyard anyway? This place smell. Weren't you the one saying you needed some more interesting locations for your photo shoots? Trust me, this place will be perfect." Jeremy led Molly around the junkyard fence till he spotted a no trespassing sign hung up. He grabbed a loose corner of the fence, holding it back for Molly to walk through. Molly scoffed as she crouched down, shuffling her way through the fence. Jeremy quickly ducked under, letting the fence snap back into place on his way through. They walked through the dusty lot, scouting for a good area for some photos. The junkyard felt endless, as they passed by countless piles of scrap metal, tires, and rusted old appliances. "Why do we have to go so far in? All of these piles of garbage look the same." Jeremy didn't pay attention to Molly's complaining. He was too focused on finding just the right spot for their photo shoot. Winding past a few more piles of junk, Jeremy's eyes lit up. He had found the spot he was looking for. In front of a mountainous pile of broken-down cars was the rusted-out shell of a 1972 Mustang. Molly checked her makeup in the side mirrors of the broken-down car, while Jeremy set his bag down assembling his camera equipment. Molly leaned on the car, cycling through her usual sultry poses as Jeremy snapped photos. As Molly kept posing, Jeremy zoned out, staring off into the distance. "Hey, why did you stop?" Jeremy let out a big sigh. "These are the same 3 poses that you do for all of your photos. I thought you wanted to give your followers something new." "I do. Hello, this is a totally different from the university campus." Jeremy opened his mouth to argue, but ended up rubbing his face in vexation instead. "Just wait here, I think I have an idea." Jeremy walked off, disappearing behind the piles of cars. Molly leaned against the broken-down Mustang, tapping her bright red nails against the car as she waited for him to come back. She could hear clangs and metal scrapping as he dug around the scrap piles. After all the waiting, she expected Jeremy to return with some impressive idea. Instead, he was holding a metal pipe. He tossed the pipe out to her, but she moved out of the way, letting it clatter to the ground. Molly looked back at him as if he had gone crazy. "Try hitting the car with it." Skeptically, Molly picked up the pipe, pointing it back at Jeremy. "Fine, we will try this your way, but if I don't get any usable shots, I'm using this on you next." Jeremy just chuckled back. "Fair enough." Standing to the side of the car, Molly swung the pipe, bouncing it off the driver's side door. "You know it's already in a junkyard. I don't think you need to hold back." Set off by the comment, she brought the pipe all the way behind her head, bringing it down on the side mirror. The mirror broke off, dangling by a wire from the car, as Molly looked surprised by her own strength. She held the pipe, flexing, amused at her achievement. "You know, this is actually pretty fun." Kicking off her high heels, she climbed up onto the car, standing on the roof. In a frenzy, she swung the pipe down at the car, smashing at the windows and hood. Jeremy circled around the car, taking shots from every angle. By the end, Molly was out of breath, panting, but had a triumphant glow about her. She hopped off the back of the car, tossing the pipe down to the ground. Molly slipped her shoes back on, catching her breath. That was actually a pretty good workout. Jeremy held the camera up, cycling through the photos he had taken. "We ended up with some really great shots. Your fans aren't going to be disappointed." A giant shadow started to fall on the pair from the enormous piles of junk. Jeremy looked up disappointedly at the sky. They were losing good lighting and wouldn't be able to shoot much longer. "We need to get one more photo before we go. I found a car crusher on the other side of this junk pile. Let's get a shot of you posing in front of it." Jeremy grabbed his bag, leading Molly around the mountain of junk to the car crusher. To Molly's surprise, this side of the lot looked a lot more orderly than the rest. There were dozens of cars that had been flattened and compacted neatly into stacked rows running alongside the car crusher. Molly stood front and center, posing with the machine in the background. She held her pose, waiting for Jeremy to snap the photo, but he had set his bag down, digging around for something. "Didn't you just say we needed to do this quick?" Jeremy barely glanced up. "Yeah, I'm just looking for my other lens. It must have fallen out of my bag." Carefully setting his camera down, Jeremy ran back to the smashed car to look for his missing camera lens. Molly sat back, leaning on one of the rows of compacted cars. She was thinking ahead about how she would debut her new set of photos. As she leaned back on the car, she felt her hand slipped off the edge of the crumpled car, sliding inside. She could feel a wave of terror wash over herself as a small set of hands grabbed onto her arm. A sharp pain shot through her arm as teeth pierced into her arm. She screamed, yanking her arm back out of the crumpled car. Clutching her arm, she backed away, keeping her eyes on the car. Jeremy came sprinting from around the corner. "What's going on?" Molly held out her arm, still clutching it with her hand. "Something just bit me." "What was it?" Wincing, Molly slowly took her hand away, revealing the bite mark on her arm. The teeth had left an imprint on her skin the size and shape of a small child's mouth. The imprint looked jagged and missing more than a few teeth. A few spots of blood started to appear on Molly's arm where the skin had been punctured. Cautiously, Jeremy walked over to the car, turning on the flashlight on his phone. Shining the light down into the car, he tried to get a look at what had bitten Molly. He couldn't see any signs of an animal. Jeremy shrugged. Whatever it was, must have run off. "Did you find your stupid lens? I'm getting out of here." Jeremy held up his camera, accidentally taking a photo. Don't you want to get the last shot? Not after something just tried to kill me. Jeremy didn't want to press his luck and walked Molly back to the hole in the fence where they snuck in. Give me a few days and I'll get the photos over to you. Molly made it back to her dorm, opening the door into a pile of her roommate's boxes. The room was overflowing with clutter. On one side were various piles of Molly's clothes, and on the other was her roommate Jessica's electrical engineering supplies. Molly kicked the box of spare electronics parts, blocking the doorway. How many times do I have to tell you? Keep your stuff on your side, Jessica. Molly had never gotten along well with her roommate, and getting bit in the junkyard did make things any better. That is on my side. Besides, aren't you supposed to be at a photo shoot? Molly held out her arm to Jessica, showing off the bite mark. We had to cut it short. The bite mark on Molly's arm had stopped bleeding, but the skin around the bite was starting to turn a sickly green. You should really go see a doctor about that. I'm sure I can just sleep it off, and it will be fine tomorrow. Jessica shook her head and went back to studying. The next morning, Jessica had already left for class by the time Molly got up. She had slept in late, but woke up feeling like she had the worst hangover of her life. Her head felt like it was splitting in half, and her entire body was aching. Getting out of bed, she pulled the blinds closed. The light coming through the window was so bright she could barely see. Crawling out of bed, she looked down at her arm and her heart raced. The bite looked even worse today. Almost her entire forearm had turned a dark green overnight. She talked to herself, trying to calm down. Okay. I just need to go to the clinic. I'm sure I just need an antibiotic or something, and clear this right up. The thought of walking across campus to the clinic made her feel exhausted. She decided if she could just get her usual latte, maybe that would give her enough of a boost to make it there. Looking down at her arm in disgust, there was no way she was going out in public like this. Grabbing for her makeup, she caked it on her arm, concealing all of the green on her forearm. She was too tired to do much else, opting to tie her hair up into a bun and throw on her roommate's sunglasses. She stumbled out the door feeling like she had been hit by a truck. Taking the stairs slowly, she shambled down and across the street to the nearest coffee shop. It was early afternoon by the time she made it into the coffee shop. With her head still throbbing, she was glad to have missed the morning rush. She ordered her usual latte and waited by the counter. The barista handed her drink across the counter, pointing to her arm. What were you painting? Molly looked at her arm in shock. The green bite was rapidly spreading over more of her skin. Molly grabbed the drink covering her arm and hurried out of the coffee shop. Standing on the sidewalk, she took a sip of her latte. Looking down, there was a small white and red lump sitting in the milk. As she nudged the lump with her finger, her heart froze. There was a human tooth in her drink. The aftertaste of copper filled her mouth. Running her tongue along her teeth confirmed her fear. One of her own teeth had fallen out into her drink. She dropped the latter to the ground, racing back to her dorm room. Bursting into her room, she tore off the sunglasses. Looking in the mirror, staring back at her was a set of yellow, jaundiced eyes. Her entire body started to shake as she took in her appearance. The green skin was rapidly spreading from her arm across her chest and covering her body. She could feel 3 more teeth fall out in her mouth, spitting them out into the sink with a mouth full of blood. She reached up to adjust the bun in her hair that had shifted to the side. As she went to adjust the mass of hair, it sloughed off into her hand. Over half her hair had fallen out in the bun, leaving patches of wispy blonde. Molly let out a shrill scream, dropping the hair to the ground. Live. Jeremy was sitting in front of his computer, poring through the hundreds of photos he had taken yesterday. He was looking for just the right photos to touch up and send back to Molly. As he quickly scrolled through the photos, he caught a glimpse of something unfamiliar in the background. Zooming in on the scrap piles, he saw a small set of beady eyes, looking back at the camera. Jeremy couldn't make out what it was, but was disconcerting that they might have been watched. He scoured through the photos, focusing on the background, hoping to catch another picture of what was spying on them. Investigating the photos more closely, almost all of them had some trace of the set of eyes in them. He got a shiver down his back, realizing he had been being watched the entire time, and not realized it. Scrolling through a dozen more photos, he found what he was searching for. In the background of the photos was a green creature that could best be described as a goblin. Caught in the act, it was lurching out of the scrap heap towards his bag. The small green creature had wrinkly green skin with beady yellow eyes and hardly any hair. He had been too caught up taking photos of Molly at the time to realize, but the photos didn't lie. The goblin had been bold enough to sneak his camera lens out his backpack when he was distracted. Part of him wanted to race back to the junkyard to get a few more photos of the goblin. After all, no one was going to believe this. But when he scrolled down to the final photo in the set, he froze. It was the picture he accidentally took of Molly right after the bite. In the background of the photo were more than a dozen sets of angry glowing eyes scowling at the camera. Putting the memory card back into his camera, he hurried over to Molly's apartment on his bike. He had to tell her what he had found and what had bitten her. On his way into the Molly's building, Jeremy practically had to dive out of the way to avoid a kid wearing a gray hoodie charging out. The kid was carrying 2 massive boxes filled to the brim with electronics and metal scraps. Jeremy wondered if they could see where they were going, or even old enough to go to school here. As quickly as the kid had run by, the thought flew out of his head. He had to find Molly and show her the unbelievable photos. When he got up to Molly's apartment, the door was flung wide open. The apartment looked like it had been ransacked. Stepping in the room, Jeremy noticed chunks of Molly's blonde hair littered across the carpet. Boxes of circuit boards had spilled and knocked over along Jessica's side of the room. Stepping further into the room, a splash of color in the sink caught his eye. He glanced over to see the blood-coated sink with a handful of teeth scattered in the basin. Instantly, he felt sick to his stomach. It dawned on him that the kid leaving the building must have attacked and robbed Molly. Running outside, he jumped on his bike. He knew the chances were slim, but he had to try to catch the thief. Pedaling his bike like a madman, he zoomed off the direction of the thief. A few blocks later, to his own surprise, he saw the outline of the kid in the gray hoodie dashing away with the boxes. Jeremy shouted for the kid to stop, but the kid picked up the pace, running even faster. The kid didn't bother to look back as screws and small parts scattered out of the boxes he had stolen. Jeremy swerved his bike, trying to dodge them. As he continued the chase, Jeremy realized where the kid was fleeing to. They were headed to the junkyard where he had met Molly. He figured the kid was looking to make a quick buck. Jeremy veered down an alley to intercept the kid right in front of the junkyard. Just as he expected, he could see the kid running up the street towards him. He couldn't get a good look at his face between the boxes and hoodie. Jeremy got off his bike, hiding at the edge of the alley. He could hear the rattling of electronics as the thief approached. He dove out from the alley, grabbing the thief by the arm. The boxes of electronics slammed to the ground, spilling across the sidewalk. Holding on to the thief's arm, they wrestled back and forth as the thief tried to get away. As they grappled back and forth, Jeremy noticed the thief's sickly green hands with red nail polish. Jeremy grabbed the thief's hood, pulling it back, and froze. Half of her face had turned wrinkled and green, but it was Molly. She had shrunk down to almost half her natural height, glaring back at him with sickly yellow eyes. Only a few patches of wispy blonde hair remained on her head. "Molly," Jeremy called out, confused. But it wasn't completely Molly anymore. She let out a sharp hiss, exposing her missing teeth and punching him in the gut. Jeremy dropped to his knee, watching her dart off through the junkyard fence. He got to his feet, chasing after her, only to slip on the scattered electronics. By the time he got to the junkyard's chain-link fence, she had disappeared behind the mountains of scrap. Pulling back the corner of the fence, he went in after her. He got his camera out of his bag, ready to snap a photo at any instant. He wanted to try to get Molly out of there. If he couldn't, he knew no one would believe this crazy story without some kind of proof. Walking through the lot, he stared at the ground, following the tiny footprints hastily made in the dirt. Hesitantly, he called out for Molly, unsure if it would coax her out or scare her off. The trail of footprints came to an end, and Jeremy looked up in surprise to see he had wound up back at the car crusher. Glancing around, he saw no signs or trace of Molly. He walked around to the crushed cars, cautiously peeking inside, thinking Molly might be hiding. A low growl emanated from one of the cars as he leaned over. He jumped back as the crumpled door swung open towards him, almost hitting him in the leg. A goblin started to crawl its way out. "Molly?" Jeremy quickly realized it wasn't the goblin he was looking for. The goblin was wearing pieced-together armor made from scrap metal. Any exposed skin he could see was covered in scars. The goblin snarled at him as it pulled a stop sign turned weapon out of the crumpled car. Jeremy wasn't sure how much of a threat the small goblin would be, but he knew he didn't want to find out. Slowly backing away, he heard a clatter of metal scraps behind him. He quickly glanced back to see 2 more goblins appearing behind him. They both looked just as sinister as the first, with junkyard armor and metal shivs in their hands. The goblin, with the stop sign, lunged forward, swinging the sign like an axe. Jeremy brought his camera up in a panic to block the blow. The camera protected him, but the clash sent it hurtling to the ground, shattering into pieces. He didn't have time to mourn his camera. All he could think about now was escaping. Turning to run, he straightened out his arm, pushing one of the goblins down to the ground. He felt a sharp sting in his leg as he passed by the other goblin. Jeremy knew he must have been stabbed, but he didn't look back. He ran as fast as he could to get away from the trio. Once he made it out of the junkyard, he would worry about patching himself up. Running away from the goblins, he rounded the corner, only to see the path blocked by a mound of metal scraps. He turned around, running down the next path he saw. He wasn't sure where it led, but anything was better than staying with the three goblins. Metal cans started to rain down on him as he ran between the piles of scrap metal. He looked up to see goblins standing on top of the piles, shaking metal pipes and hurling anything they could get their hands on down at him. Jeremy grabbed a metal trash can lid out of a nearby pile, holding it over his head as a shield. It offered some protection as cans clanked off the lid, but it didn't deter the goblins. More objects continued to rain down as he ran through the junkyard. Jeremy kept moving forward, looking for an exit. His legs started to buckle as he jogged along. Looking back at his leg, he saw a metal shiv poking out of the side of his thigh. A thick yellow liquid was running off the handle. His heart started to race even faster, worried that he was poisoned and might face the same fate as Molly. There wasn't any way he could save her now. All he could focus on was trying to get out in one piece himself. More objects rained down from behind, forcing Jeremy to turn around and guard himself with the lid. Backing up, he didn't see the drop behind him. His foot stepped back into the air with nothing under it, sending him tumbling to the ground. The rain of objects had stopped as he stood back up to find himself in a shallow dirt pit surrounded by junk. Dozens of goblins appeared, lining the side of their dirt arena. They banged metal weapons together and cheered as Goblin Molly descended into the arena wearing her grey hoodie. A goblin wearing a crown made of scraps tossed down a hammer, landing at Molly's feet. She picked up the hammer, clutching it in her green hands. "Cha!" she let out with a hiss, charging at Jeremy. He held the trash can lid like a shield, ramming her back toward the dirt wall of the arena. Her small body was sent flying, but she was back on her feet in an instant. Jeremy pulled the shiv out of his leg, getting ready to defend himself. His body was heavy with each move that he made. As Molly charged at him again, he raised his trash can shield to block Molly's next swing. Instead of hitting the lid like he expected, pain exploded from his foot as Molly's strike slammed down. Jeremy cried out, collapsing to the ground, dropping the metal shiv to the side. With a trembling arm, he weakly brought up his hand, trying to hold Molly back as she closed in. For a brief moment, Jeremy's arm held her back until she bit down on his arm with her remaining teeth. His arm fell to the side as she strolled up beside his head. Whatever the goblins had poisoned him with was in full effect. Jeremy could barely move a muscle as she approached. He could hear the goblins cheering and laughing as she raised the hammer up into the air. The dark silhouette of the hammer came smashing down, crushing Jeremy's skull. He had died after the first swing, but that didn't stop Molly's fury as the other goblins cheered her on. The night clerk isn't here, so I'm filling in for his shift. I was never supposed to work the night shift. I had always been the daytime receptionist at the Silent Oaks Motel, a rundown roadside stop, barely managing to stay in business. My shift was simple: check-ins, check-outs, and handling the occasional lost key. At 10 p.m., I was supposed to clock out, go home, and forget this place until morning. That was the routine. That was how it was meant to be. But that night, something changed. Pete, the old manager, called me into his office just as I was gathering my things. He didn't look at me right away, just fumbled with a set of keys on his desk. His fingers trembled slightly as he pushed them toward me. "You're staying tonight," he muttered, his voice oddly flat. I frowned. "Why?" Pete finally met my eyes, but there was something off about his expression, something vacant, like he was staring through me rather than at me. "The night guy didn't show up. You're the only one who can do it." His tone was firm but distant, like he wasn't really there. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words never came. Pete's stare was unsettling. There was no frustration, no annoyance, Just a blank sort of expectation, like he already knew I wouldn't argue. It sent a chill through me. I hesitated. The motel felt different at night. Heavier, quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful. I could already feel that silence creeping in. But what choice did I have? Before I could think of a way out, Pete grabbed his coat and walked out the door. Just like that, I was alone. By 10:45 p.m., I was sitting at the front desk, staring at the outdated lobby decor. The motel felt different. The same cracked tiles, the same faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, but now everything seemed more alive in the worst way. The walls cracked, not randomly, but in a slow rhythmic pattern, like the building itself was breathing. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed with a dull electric hum, flickering just enough to set my nerves on edge. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. It was just another shift. Just a few more hours, and I'd be out of here. I had to kill time somehow. The old wooden desk had a few drawers, so I started pulling them open one by one, sifting through the clutter. The first drawer held nothing but crumpled receipts and an old motel guest book covered in coffee stains. The second had a stapler and a few loose papers. Then I reached the bottom drawer. It was already open, just a crack. I frowned. I didn't remember seeing it open earlier. Slowly, I pulled it all the way out. Inside, there was only one thing. A tape recorder. It was old, one of those bulky plastic-cased models from decades ago, its once white surface now yellowed with age. A cassette was already inside. The label was faded, the ink smudged, but I could still make out the words written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Do not erase. A strange feeling crept up my spine, cold and unwelcome. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly didn't want to touch it. The drawer had been slightly open, like someone had left it that way on purpose, like they wanted me to find it. I sat there for a long moment, just staring at it. Then, against my better judgment, I reached out. My fingers barely brushed the plastic when a gust of cold air rushed past me. I jerked back. The motel door was still shut. The windows were closed. There was no draft. I swallowed hard. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Slowly I pressed play. The tape whirred, the static crackling through the speaker before a voice emerged, low, strained, exhausted. The voice in the tap is speaking now. If you're listening to this, that means you're on the night shift. The voice was male, tense, like he was holding back something worse than fear. I don't know how much time I have left, but if someone else gets stuck here, maybe this will help. A pause. The silence between his words felt heavier than the static. There are things in this motel at night, things that shouldn't be here. Another pause. The kind that makes you hold your breath. I didn't know the rules. I had to learn the hard way. Then, 3 slow knocks were heard from the tape. The voice on the tape trembled. The first time I heard the knocking, I thought it was a guest. I gripped the desk. It was past midnight. I went to the door. My stomach clenched. A man was standing outside, hale, tall, wearing a suit. I felt a pulse in my throat. The voice continued. I asked if he needed a room. He didn't answer. I swallowed hard. My throat dry, as if all the moisture had been sucked out of the air. A cold feeling crawled up my spine, making my skin prickle. Something about him felt off. Not just the silence, but the way he stood there, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. I should have shut the door. I should have walked away. The thought screamed in my head, a desperate warning. But my hands stayed frozen on the counter. My feet didn't move. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Either way, I didn't turn away. Instead, I met his eyes, dark, unreadable, like staring into an empty void. Something about them made my stomach tighten. Still, I forced my voice to stay steady. Do you need a room? I asked again. He didn't respond, not with words. Instead of answering, he smiled. But when he smiled, it wasn't right. It was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. His teeth were too sharp, too white, almost glistening under the dim motel lights. It wasn't the kind of smile people gave when they were happy. It was something else. Something is wrong. He stepped forward. I stepped back. He kept coming. His gaze, locked onto mine. A slow, deliberate movement, like a predator sizing up its prey. I stepped back again, my hand brushing against the edge of the counter. Too close. Suddenly, he was inches from my face, so near I could see the fine cracks in his lips, smell the faint, metallic scent clinging to his breath. That grin never wavered. His teeth looked sharper now, as if they had grown in the space of a second. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slammed the door shut. My heart pounded as I locked it, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had walked away. Then, scratch. A slow, deliberate sound. Scratch. Like nails dragging against the wood. A whisper of a noise, but somehow louder than anything else in the stillness of the night. And that's when it hit me. If someone knocks after midnight, don't answer. That's rule number 1. That's when I learned rule number 1. I thought it was over. I sat behind the counter, heart still hammering, ears straining for any sound beyond the hum of the motel's old ceiling fan. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second stretching longer than the last. Then, at 1:33 a.m., the phone rang. The sudden noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. My pulse spiked. The motel phone rarely rang at this hour, and after what had just happened, I should have ignored it. But I didn't. I answered. That was my second mistake. The moment I lifted the receiver to my ear, I knew something was wrong. The voice on the other end, it sounded like my mother. My stomach dropped. My mother has been dead for 5 years. The voice was soft, distant, layered with static, like an old warped cassette tape. "Hello?" I whispered, throat tightening. There was a pause. Then, she said my name, again, and again, and again. Each time, the same tone, the same inflection. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't even real. Like a recording stuck on a loop. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles turning white. My breath came out shaky. Then, the voice changed. It dropped lower, slower, and said, "Let me in." A chill ran through me so fast, it felt like ice water had been poured down my spine. I hung up. My hands were shaking as I dropped the receiver back onto the cradle. The phone rang again, and again, and again. Each time, the shrill, electronic wail cut through the silence, clawing at my nerves. I didn't pick up. I didn't have to. Because now, I understood. If the phone rings after 1 a.m., don't answer. That's rule number 2. That's when I learned rule number 2. The night dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, thick and suffocating. I sat frozen behind the desk, too scared to move, too afraid to even shift in my chair. Every sound, the distant hum of the vending machine, the creak of the old motel walls, felt magnified, unnatural. Then, at 3 a.m., the TV flickered. The screen, dead and dark just a second ago, flashed to life with a burst of static, a crackling. Broken hiss filled the air, making my skin crawl. I hadn't touched the remote. No one had. But the TV turned on by itself. My breath caught in my throat. The old motel television wasn't even modern. No automatic power on, no smart features. It should have stayed off, but it didn't. At first, I thought it was just static, the white noise swirling in random chaotic patterns. Then the image sharpened. It was the motel security footage. I frowned, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The cameras were meant to show the parking lot, the hallways, the back entrance, standard views for security. But something was wrong. The cameras, they weren't showing the parking lot. They weren't showing the hallways either. They were showing me, not me sitting at the desk. Me, standing outside, staring at the front door. A sick feeling spread through my chest. My body locked up. I stopped breathing. It was live footage. I was watching myself, but I was here. I was inside. I wasn't outside. The me on the screen was completely still, standing in the dim glow of the motel's neon sign. My head was tilted slightly downward, my arms limp at my sides, but my face was nothing but a blur. And then, the me on the screen started smiling. A slow, deliberate grin stretched across its face. Too wide, too unnatural. Teeth glinted in the dim light. My stomach twisted. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to look away. I needed to, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on the screen, unable to tear away from the sight of myself, of something that looked like me, grinning like a hungry predator. That's when I learned rule number 3. If the TV turns on by itself, don't look at it. By the time 4 a.m. came, I was already a wreck. My hands were ice cold, my legs numb from sitting in the same position for hours. My entire body ached with exhaustion, but I didn't dare close my eyes. The motel was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was the kind that felt wrong, like something was waiting just out of sight, just beyond my reach. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could make it to sunrise, this nightmare would end. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I heard my own voice calling from the hallway. A chill ran down my spine so fast, it left me lightheaded. It was me, my voice, calling for help. Help me. A raw, desperate sob. Please. The sound of someone crying, my voice, my cries, echoed through the empty hall. It was weak, trembling, broken, begging. It sounded like I was dying. I clenched my fists so hard, my nails dug into my palms. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, refusing to move. I wanted to run, to find the source of the voice, to help, but I was sitting right here. I knew it wasn't real, but my voice kept crying out. And it lasted for minutes. Agonizing, torturous minutes of hearing myself sob and plead, growing more desperate with each passing second. Then, the crying stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. A terrible, suffocating silence. Then, from outside the lobby, I heard the laughter. My own laughter. Low at first, then growing louder. Amused, almost gleeful. It sent an icy wave of fear through me, worse than anything before. I was confused, terrified, unable to process what was actually happening. I sat there, my breath shallow, my heart hammering. And then, I knew. This is rule number 4. No matter what you hear, do not leave the front desk after 4 a.m. By now, exhaustion had seeped into my bones. I needed to get out of there, but my shift dragged on, refusing to end. Every second felt like a lifetime. Then, at 4:45 a.m., I heard someone whisper my name. Soft, almost gentle. My entire body tensed. It wasn't the harsh static of the phone. It wasn't the distorted, unnatural tone from the TV. It wasn't even the eerie mimicry of my own voice. This was different. It sounded human, familiar, even. And it came from room 209. A sharp chill ran through me. That room had been empty for years. I knew that. The motel records confirmed it. The manager had warned me on my first day. The room hadn't been rented out since before my time. And yet, the voice had come from there. I should have stayed put. I should have ignored it. But my feet were already moving. I stepped into the hallway. The corridor was dim, the overhead lights flickering faintly. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something I couldn't name. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I moved closer, step by step, until I saw it. The door to 209 was open, wide open. Darkness pooled inside like ink, swallowing every detail past the threshold. I saw someone standing in the corner, a shadowy figure, completely still. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. I swallowed, my breath unsteady. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to turn around, to run back to the front desk and never look back. But something made me stay. I forced myself to whisper, "Who's there?" For a second, silence. Then, it whispered back, "Come closer." The voice was soft, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. My breath caught, my chest tightened. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. So, I did. I turned and sprinted down the hall, barely aware of my own panicked footsteps echoing against the walls. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't care who or what that was. I reached the front desk, gasping for air, my hands shaking violently. That's when I learned rule number 5. If you hear your name from room 209, don't respond. I don't know if I'll make it to sunrise. But I need to say this before it's too late. There's a final rule. The most important one. If you're listening to this recording and you hear breathing behind you, don't turn around. The sound of a ragged breath, not from the speaker, but from somewhere close, right next to the microphone. Then, a loud click. The tape ends. I sat there, frozen. The recorder was still in my hand, but my fingers had gone numb. The room was silent. I didn't dare move. The words from the tape echoed in my mind, looping over and over like a warning I had no choice but to obey. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, but I forced myself to breathe as slowly as possible. Then, carefully, I reached for my bag. My hands were trembling as I stuffed the recorder inside. I didn't want to touch it anymore. I didn't even want to look at it. I needed to leave, now. I grabbed my keys off the counter, shoved the motel log into a drawer without caring if it made a sound, and turned toward the exit. I was done. I was never coming back here. But then I heard a ragged breath. Right behind me. Every muscle in my body locked up. My throat tightened. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't turn around. The words from the recording burned into my brain like a brand. My hands clenched into fists. I wasn't breathing anymore. Then, click. The sound of the tape recorder. My stomach dropped. It had turned on by itself. I didn't move. I didn't reach for it. The static crackled, filling the empty space around me. Then, the voice came through. But this time, it wasn't his. It was mine. I don't know how it got there, but I didn't think much, and I ran, and I never went back to the motel. My job is to chop up dead bodies, and one of them won't stop moving. If oversharing were a sport, Veronica would take Olympic gold. I'd like to say I'd known Roni all my life, and most people would believe it based on how much I knew about her. There wasn't any part of her life she didn't tell me. Stories, memories, and ideas flowed out of her effortlessly, restraint being a completely foreign concept to her. I never minded though. I'm perfectly content to let her talk herself hoarse, even if my ears fell off. She needed the release as much as I needed the noise, an effortless symbiosis that powered our friendship. I knew how she almost cut her thumb off with a paring knife when she was 6, how she snuck 3 people into her room through her 3rd-story window, and where her mom hid the colored contacts. People couldn't even tell her mom wore them in the first place. Despite all of it, the stories, embarrassments, long nights watching scary movies, everything, she found ways to ask about me between breaths. My hobbies, interests, and aspirations were absorbed with as much clarity as her own. And she remembered too. She could recall fine details about anything, even if I'd only mentioned it once. For better or worse, Roni has a big memory and an even bigger mouth. We went everywhere together, clinging to each other like conjoined twins. We were a package deal that wouldn't be separated. That's what made college that much more scary. High school finished unceremoniously, Roni graduating with high honors and a fancy scholarship to UPenn to study biochemistry. I didn't have the aptitude she had, so I settled on a quiet state school an hour from my house. In hindsight, I should have known the world wouldn't be kind enough to keep us together. I hadn't known her for that long, but it felt like a piece of me was scooped out, the space she occupied refusing to fill. I felt hollow, weak, gray. A promise to stay in touch and continue to talk every single day seemed just as hollow. Anyone in a long-distance relationship knows how Herculean a task like that can be, especially between college students. Over time, little by little, we fell out of touch. Calling every Sunday turned into every other Sunday. Then a few times a month, I would respond to her posts, always being met with an enthusiastic, "Let's catch up soon," followed by even more weeks of silence. Time marched onward, and Roni receded further into my memory. By my senior year of college, I only thought of her when I smelled old pennies or lavender perfume, or when I'd go to our favorite coffee shop back home. Times like that. After I graduated college, I found myself stuck. I was unsure of my expectations and equally unwilling to find out. My diploma says I had a degree in biology, but was that truly what I wanted to do in life? As many other broke college graduates come to realize, I probably should figured that out before the loans piled up. With bills flooding my mailbox and no time to regret my decisions, I found a job at a body donation facility without bogging down the flow. This is the gist. The company connects the recently deceased with organizations that can use their bodies for science. Those who want to donate their bodies to further scientific and medical education are taken to the facility, processed, and dismembered according to the needs of the client. After that, their body parts are shipped to them in big metal trucks all across the country. So, as the title suggests, my job is to process the donors, dismember them, and package them. Lucky me. Despite the grotesque nature of the work itself, I work alongside a great team, the pay is good, and I finally feel like I've carved a path for myself. If that means I have to work in a literal icebox with dead bodies every day, so be it. Adjusting to the smell was easier than I expected. The N95 doing most of the heavy lifting, but even for the more difficult aspects, it was relieving to know I had good co-workers to lean on if I needed it. Unfortunately, this seemed to be one of those days. Djinn, the most senior of us, was the de facto leader, responsible for reading out the orders, indicating what specimen needed to be procured from a given donor. Lukewarm coffee in hand, she scanned through her clipboard, occasionally blurting out procurement notes. Patient 5, cephalic, bilateral, P3, and eviscerate. Who wants it? Cephalic means head. Bilateral means both arms. P3 was shorthand for pelvis to toes, and eviscerate means, well, exactly what it sounds like. Calling them our patients always made me chuckle, but it felt more natural than calling them donors. We obviously weren't treating them, but we handled them with the same level of care. After a pause, Jess's hand rose lazily. Yeah, sure, I got it. Also, how many total today again? 11 total. Erin replied, eyes never leaving the clipboard. Ideally well be out of here on time. Don't fuck anything up, messy. Jessie scowled at her, her faint grin peeking out from over the clipboard. He grumbled out a weak retort. Nina, Ty and I, snickering at the two of them. Erin continued, the 5 of us silently choosing our patients for the day. We all ended up with 2 patients. Erin solemnly taking the extra. She droned through the memos, gave us a curt nod, and shooed us toward the changing rooms. The mornings were always slow, but we had the luxury of working at our own pace. We gowned up in silence, slipping our masks and goggles on before moving to the box. The box, as it was affectionately nicknamed, was our workspace. Large metal lab tables lined the windowless room, blinking LEDs above each one. An industrial tool closet sat in the far corner of the room, housing all of our daily equipment. Contrary to my assumptions, the box was typically flooded with a pungent lemony smell instead of the stench of death. The scented chemical cleaners cemented a permanent citrus odor into the space, interrupted only by the assault that was procurement. The worst part of the box was the ventilation. Predictably, massive gusts of air pumped into the room, just cold enough for us to work on the donors without freezing ourselves. A neat row of human-sized cubby holes lined the back wall, all of them adorned with walk-in freezer handles. Canvas-covered gurneys were parked against the other wall, a line of mottled gray toes peeking out from the end of each one. The only color in the room was the neon yellow tags separating each donor, tied to the big toes like yard signs. Ty yawned audibly, dragging his hand through the tags before moving to the tool closet, flicking on our portable speaker on the way. Aight. Who needs what? Anything specific or just the use? Just scalpel and saw for me, please. I chirped, the mask muffling most of my voice. I flashed me a thumbs up, taking requests from each of us in order. Setting my supplies aside, I found my first patient and wheeled them out to my table. Each patient always had their documentation at their feet, complete with a medical history, cause of death, and procurement details. I quickly scanned the paper, eager to get the first one out of the way as Led Zeppelin crackled out from the speakers. Peeling back the canvas, I greeted my first patient, their shriveled gray face and milky eyes offering no reply. My face tightening reflexively, I went through my usual assessment. I checked his entire body for surgery and fracture scars, peeled back his eyelids for any corneal abrasions, gently palpated his stomach for any excess gastrointestinal movement, and flexed all of his appendages. All scars accounted for, no abrasions, no GI movement, and all appendages had full flexion and extension. Writing down my notes, I watched as his half-open eyelid drooped close, gravity attempting to revert my inspection. Erin often had to remind me that it's not like they're gonna protest. but it still gave me the creeps watching bodies move without my help, especially after jostling them around so much. Forcing my goosebumps to recede, I was interrupted by Nina, a look of indignation plastered on her face. "Hey, you good over there, Nina?" "Huh?" "Oh yeah, sorry. Check this out though. Poor girl." I set the documents down, all of us now clustered around Nina's patient. She was just as grey as my patient, but her face was covered with purple bruises, a long gash wedged between her eyebrows. From a quick scan, I figured maybe it was from a fall, but her torso told another story. A smattering of brown and purple bruises painted her skin, her chest visibly concaving in the center of it all. She had to be no older than mid-50s, younger than the majority of our patients. I caught a pitied sigh from Erin, striding over to gently palpate the stomach. A wretched crunch and gurgle escaped the woman, a dark maroon pool rising in their mouth. Wincing at the guttural noise, I watched the donor's sallow stomach distend once more, the pool in her mouth draining back inside her. Ugh, how tragic. Car accident, yeah? Yeah, Nina sighed, eyes downcast. No older than my mom too, just terrible. She trailed off, the rest of us digesting the scene. Sigh, the least experienced of us, chimed in. So, wait, that was her blood. How does that work? Well, Erin grunted, wiping her hands on her smock. Most likely rupture from the crash. Internal bleeding from an aortic rupture, I'd say. Nina, she have eviscerate orders. Nina slipped her gloves off, flipping through the folder of documents carefully. Nope, not her. Violet forearms, knee down and pelvis. Why? We're gonna have to discard the rest anyway. So after y'all finish your first procurement, we can check out what happened together. She patted the patient's bony shoulder, the rest of us nodding eagerly. Hey Jesse, slide that trash over here. Jesse positioned the trash beside the patient's ribs, already knowing where this was going. With practiced precision, Erin lined up a scalpel blade between ribs 9 and 10, dragging the blade swiftly between them. Tar black ichor drained from the incision, a sickly waterfall of blood, cascading into the trash noiselessly. Give her, I don't know, 20 minutes draining before you go for that pelvis, unless you feel like getting showered. Nina shrugged playfully, Jesse's eyes puckering beneath his goggles. Hey, not this early, Minnie. I've already queued just to get high, and I don't want my tears mixing with your gut juice. We all groaned in unison, the mere mention of Nickelback putting a bad taste in our mouths. Jesse raised his hands defensively, Ty giving him a light punch on the arm before sauntering over to his table again, smiling inside my mask. I walked over to my station, immigrant song gracing my ears once more. My first patient was a cephalic, bilat hands, and a P3. Going for the head first was always a pain, but it made the weight distribution for the P3 a little more manageable. Cradling his head in my arms, scalpel at the ready, I glanced up at the row of gurneys. For whatever reason, the last one in the row caught my eye, and it only took a moment to realize why. Despite all donors having a yellow ticket on the toe, one gurney at the end of the line was missing theirs. I frowned, hoping Ty didn't lose it accidentally. Counting as I went, the last gurney had no paperwork or tag anywhere in sight, my frown turning to intrigue. Hey Erin, I called out over my shoulder. You sure we only had 11 today? Erin looked up from her donor, scalpel in hand. Yep, just 11 today. What's up? There's an extra in the line. Late arrival. It wasn't uncommon for us to get 1 or 2 donors delivered throughout the day, but they were always dropped off with their paperwork and yellow tag. Erin groaned, already irritated at the possibility of lost paperwork. Wasn't told about any extras today. Maybe they just came early, to be processed tomorrow. Fair enough, but wouldn't they have their documents and stuff? Personal effects too. I mean, they're supposed to. Torin continued, sidling up at the foot of the gurney. She peeked under the tarp, squatting down to look around, and underneath the donor. Guess they're missing theirs. Mind wheeling them over to the auxiliary freezers down the hall. We'll try to get a hold of our delivery guys and see what the deal is. No problem, I replied, setting my current patient's head down. I traded spots with Erin, rolling the mystery donor down the dark hallway to auxiliary storage. Beyond the strange lack of documentation and yellow tag, other things felt off about the donor. As the gurney's bad wheel echoed noisily, I noticed their toes were much pinker than other donors were. It wasn't unheard of to get a young donor, but it was certainly rare, And all the sadder. The canvas had a thin layer of dust on it too, typical of donors who've been left out for a few days. I certainly don't remember anyone behind on their work, especially for a donor this young. What gives? Was this supposed to be in our caseload today? I shook off the notion. Erin is a robot when it comes to bookkeeping. She wouldn't have forgotten one. Stepping into the auxiliary freezer room, I pushed my donor toward the nearest open cubby. The freezer door already opened for preservation. Lining them up with the cubby, I suddenly stopped cold, a wave of confusion climbing up my spine. They didn't just move, did they? No, I saw something move for sure. But that can't be. I must moved funny when I was lining them up. Scrunching up my face, I grabbed a corner of the canvas, intent on ripping it off and onto the floor, but I was stopped yet again. Movement, a shift underneath, near the face. I knew I wasn't imagining it. But then, what? How? I swallowed hard, unable to process the scene as I dragged the canvas off. Finally exposed, I sighed in relief, laughing at myself sheepishly. Her paperwork was just sitting on her face instead of her legs. Of course it would shift as I repositioned her. I shook my head in embarrassment. Thankful Jesse or Ty weren't there to make fun of me. The donor was indeed young, a cavalcade of blonde hair spilling out behind the thick manila folder. Her hands rested gently at her sides, palms toward the sky in peace. Her skin was remarkably clean, bereft of any bruising or scar tissue, save for a nearly imperceptible scar on her thumb, just below the joint. I blinked for a moment, processing silently. So, if she does have her paperwork, I should bring her back, right? Picking up the documents, intent on finding their filing date. Her face shot spikes through me, eyes anchored on her visage. The folder slipped from my grasp, the sounds of falling paper echoing in the isolated room, mouth agape and hands trembling. I grabbed the wall for support as a torrent of memories overwhelmed my senses, my breathing rapid and shallow. It was Roni. Her cheeks were slightly pink, but she was most certainly dead. I wheezed through my mask, the world refusing to stop spinning. Worst of all, with her eyes half open and palms to the sky, she was smiling like a fool, teeth glittering in the low light, not another wrinkle in sight. The color drained from my face, a torrent of physical shock setting in. I wanted to scream, I wanted to puke, and I wanted to leave. Even now, writing this, I don't know what compelled me to stay, but I eventually hobbled over to her, my eyes the size of dinner plates. Hundreds of questions flooded my brain, spiraling into a vortex of panic and grief. Then, all at once, it merged into a perfect, all-encompassing dread. Roni's eyelids drifted closed, moving without my help. The Djinn offered me 3 wishes. I only needed one. My grandfather passed away during a blizzard. It was a freak October storm that tore through the northeast like a knife through butter. I remember my mom calling him in a panic, and I could hear his gruff, dismissive tone over the phone. Pappy Jerry was like that often. Despite being damn near 80, he insisted on staying in his decaying home. It was nearly 2 weeks before the roads were clear enough, and Mom made the pilgrimage to Pappy's homestead. When she arrived, she discovered he had been completely snowed in. She called out to no response, and began digging. She had found Pappy glued to his porch chair, frost and icicles still clinging to his ghostly visage. He was bundled up, yes, but he was as stiff as a board, a broad smile etched onto his face forever. The screaming began shortly after this discovery. Paramedics had tried desperately to calm my poor mother, but they ended up having to restrain her. Cops on the scene were bewildered. He was sat perfectly in his rickety old chair. His expression was that of joy and mania. The strange thing is, as the first responders and paramedics began to clear away the snow, they found evidence that someone had built snowmen in the yard. 2 or 3 large snowmen with button eyes and gumball smiles littered Grandpa Jerry's front lawn. Mom never truly recovered from discovering her father's remains. She was sitting quietly in the back during the funeral, a veil hiding her hysterics. She would wake up screaming in the night, and my dad would hold her as she sniffled and wept into his arms. Every time I visited home, she seemed to get worse and worse. Some days she would just sit in the den, curled up with quilts and heavy blankets staring into space. When the time came to clear out Granddad's place, it was left to me and my dad. The inside of his decrepit tomb was a hoarder's wet dream, Newspaper lined the walls, and the floor was a parade of trash and dust. It took over 3 dozen trash bags just to clear out his den. The kitchen was a moldy mess, the bathroom a biohazard, and the bedrooms stank to high heaven. I was shocked at the state of it, honestly. Jerry had become a recluse past couple year, but I remember him being very outgoing and clean. He used to travel and world and bring back all sorts of trinkets and toys to spoil us grandkids with. Which leads us to the lamp. The lamp was tucked away in the corner of a dresser. I scoffed when I found it. It looked like the most stereotypical Arabian lamp you could ever see. It looked like Jerry had plucked it right out of a Disney movie. I heard rustling behind me and turned to see my dad carefully tearing the crusty sheets off Jerry's mattress. I held it up for him to see like jingling keys for a baby. Dad eyed the lamp and let out a hearty chuckle. "That's your grandpa's old Djinn lamp," he replied so casually. "It's his what?" I sputtered with laughter. "Yay, Jerry picked it up at some market in God knows whereistan," my father explained. "He'd show it off at parties. They're people to rub it, that sort of thing." I don't know if he actually believed in it, but he'd get super pissed if anyone called it a genie lamp, said it was disrespectful. To that he shrugged his shoulders. I glanced down at the lamp skeptically. I pocketed it and returned to my work. A magic lamp sounds crazy, but in the back of my mind I remembered something. When my mum was growing up, Grandpa Jerry lost his job. Money was tight for a long time, until one day Grandpa came home grinning ear to ear. He said money wasn't going to be an issue any longer, and that he didn't want his little Sarah to worry any longer. It was true. Grandpa then had a seemingly endless supply of cash. Said his investments had finally paid off. My mother could never recall what exactly he invested in, but the money flow didn't end until she graduated college. That's when some swindler got Grandpa to invest in a pyramid scheme, and he lost everything. But he didn't care. He was just happy. My mother had been taken care of. I thought about that old family fable the rest of the day. A raging storm of what-ifs fondled my mind as I poured at the lamp in my hand, laying on my bed. I studied the thing. How did they do it in the fairy tales? Rub it 3 times or something like that. I was hesitant at first, but found myself more curious than anything. I rubbed the lamp 3 times and nothing. There was a dead silence in my room. Outside I could hear crickets chirping, and I could feel my face flush with embarrassment. Wasn't sure why I was embarrassed. There was no one around but me. In a huff, I tossed the lamp aside and went back to scrolling on my phone. I was so engaged in the latest asinine reel I didn't even hear it at first. Scott, Scott, Scott. I paused my scrolling and looked up. Skirt, skirt. Again, that scatting noise, like something was scratching up my walls. I turned my flashlight on and found nothing. Skort sket. SKRT. Right on my ear. I jerked backwards only to face my headboard. It's probably a mouse coming in from the cold, I thought, putting aside my fright. My phone dinged and I glanced to find a snap from my friend Terry. It was some flirty pic overlaid with a dozen filters. I rolled my eyes and got ready to snap her back, turning my bedside lamp on. I tousled my hair and put on my best sleepy look as I pulled up the front-facing camera. My face then contorted in confusion. There seemed to be a filter already on. It was my face all right. Chiseled jawline, fluffy hair, and a well-trimmed black goatee. But my skin was a crimson hue, ears with tipped points, and my eyes were solid black with ruby iris staring back at me. I shuddered at the strange filter and tried to change it to something glossier. Switched it, nothing changed. Switched it to dog ears, nothing changed. Switched it to a damn ad filter. Nothing changed. My heart skipped as the face on my phone began to smile. It leaned closer, like it was going to leap out of my phone. I threw it aside with a yelp. A light turned on from the hallway. I froze, realizing I hadn't heard my parents come in the driveway. "Heech, hello," I called out meekly. I was met with silence. My phone buzzed again, and I reached for it. It was a snap from an unknown user. I played it, and was met with a video of my bathroom. The light turned on, blinding the camera. I could hear a muffled voice call out hello, and the video ended. My eyes darted to the still-lit hall, and I got up, dreading what I would find in the bathroom. The upstairs hall was silent, illuminated only by the dim hum of the bath. I peeked my head inside, seeing nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the mirror. A dark shape loomed in it. its ruby red glare dancing like flames. I opened my mouth about to let out a horrified shriek when I felt something grab me by the hand and yank me into the bathroom. The door slammed shut behind me. The click of a lock rang out. I darted around in a panic, finally landing on the bathroom mirror. The twisted devil version of me stood where I did, grinning like a mad jackal. His hair seemed to move about his own, this illusion giving off waves of contempt. He beckoned me forward and took a bow as I approached. "Forgive my theatrics, master. It's just been so long since I've received new company." The demon purred. Its voice was wavy yet graveled, like he was speaking through a broken speaker. "What are you?" I muttered under my breath. The demon did not break contact as he explained. "I am the Djinn of the lamp. You have rubbed it 3 times. Now, I am your humble servant. You may call me Sharun." The Djinn cooed. "This is insane," I said under my breath. The Sharun laughed at this. "Many have said the same in your shoes, master. Yet all would come to know my reality," he rasped. "What is it you desire? I can offer you such pleasures, or deal misery to your enemies." He growled like a hungry tiger. My mind raced 1,000 times a minute. I could have it all: wealth, power, fame. But that was cliché, wasn't it? There was always a catch when dealing with the devil. Sharun titled his head, like he could sense my hesitation. He pursed his lips and offered up a tale. "You have your grandfather's eyes, child." He was hesitant to use my power as well, but in the end I served him well, for it is my nature. Sharun offered. My eyes flicked to the floor. "Use his power," he said. Asking for my own riches was selfish, an abuse of power. If I could have anything in the world, it would be Sharun. "I know what my wish will be," I exclaimed proudly. His knife-point ears perked up. "What is your desire?" He salivated. "My mother. She hasn't been herself since Grandpa died. Sharun, I wish for you to make my mother happy." I spoke. Sharun sneered, a giddy look smearing his face. The lights flickered, and he disappeared from the mirror. "It is done," his voice echoed out. With that he was gone. I blinked, and I found myself back in bed. Had I not seen the lamp leaning against the bedroom wall, I would have put that whole thing off as some weird dream. The morning sun dangled through the windows like a tease, and I rubbed my eyes through the fog. From downstairs I heard whistling. I frowned, hurrying to see what all the fuss was about. I found my mom downstairs whistling like a happy housemaid whipping up a massive breakfast. Dad was sitting at the table, an uneasy look on his face. My mother turned to face me as I entered, a smile a mile long plastered on her face. Her eyes were bulging with happiness, and she rushed towards me, a motherly embrace. "Good morning, Benny. Isn't it a lovely day?" she sang. She pinched my cheek and went back to working the stove, resuming her merry little tune as well. I slid next to Dad, hearing the anxious tap-tap-tap of his feet. "She's been like this all morning," he whispered next to me. "A massive mood swing like this. It worries me, Ben." He sounded concerned, but I shrugged it off with a sheepish grin. "She's happy now. What's to worry about?" I said as a plateful of bacon and eggs fell to the table. My mother stayed grinning and giddy the whole morning, and the morning after that, and so on and so on. My mother hasn't stopped smiling in months. She never cries. She never changes her ghastly grin. She was watching the news and saw something about a bombing, and she laughed and laughed. Last night, I came home to find her standing next to the stove top giggling to herself. She was holding her hand above a flame, roasting herself. I pulled her away and asked what the hell. She just giggled as I applied bandages to her. My father is convinced she's in the middle of a massive manic episode. I'm not so sure, even though I see Sharun out of the corner of my eye, asking if I am pleased with my wish. That's it for tonight's stories, but the nightmares never end. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Got a scary experience of your own? Share it in the comments. I just might feature it in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some things are scarier than they seem in the dark.